He used to be called Citizen 625726. He used to call himself Unbroken. When he left his dystopian city behind, he thought he had found paradise. What he found was uglier and darker than anything he could have imagined. This is his story. This is Inferior. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. So, 2 disclaimers before I begin. First, my original intention with Knights of the Old Republic was to record my first ever playthrough of the game and then give my thoughts on it. Unfortunately, while I was editing the various clips together, something went wrong with QuickTime on my computer, it froze, and then when it came back, the file was no longer usable. A third of my recorded material was no longer available to me. After 30 seconds of screaming and narrowly resisting the impulse to throw various objects against the wall, I decided that since the focus of this video is the story of Knights of the Old Republic rather than the game in its totality anyway, and at least providing some content for this month, I had to resort to using footage from YouTube. As such, my first order of business is to direct you to the description, where I've provided links to the channels from which most of this content is coming from. These are good people and they make good content. The least I can do is promote them. If you like what they do, subscribe. Second, assuming you paid attention to the title card of this video, you already know what the verdict is with regards to Knights of the Old Republic's canon status, in my opinion. When I began my own playthrough for the first time, I was prepared for it to be good, but a small cynical part of me whispered that maybe, just maybe, most of the Star Wars fandom have just been wearing the nostalgia goggles too much. However, it didn't take long for that small, cynical voice to be utterly silenced, and once I was certain that this was indeed going to get a canon verdict, I decided that I was not going to insult the intelligence of my audience by pretending suspense. I will, however, leave you in suspense for the next 2 months by leaving open the question of whether or not I think the sequel was better. So, Knights of the Old Republic, one of the most famous and beloved entries in the Star Wars franchise. That rare instance of an entry in Star Wars that is regarded not only as universally good, but practically sacrosanct. How did it all come to be? Our story begins in the year 2000 with the accession of a new president at LucasArts, Simon Jeffries. Jeffries was a man with a mission: make the best Star Wars games possible and thus bring both profit and prestige to the brand of LucasArts. And if he believed that working with other developers would create better games, he would do just that. As previously mentioned on my channel, this is the reason why the Jedi Knight series, which had originally begun in-house at LucasArts, was given over to the developer Raven Software, which resulted in the superlative Jedi Outcast and the narratively lacking but otherwise excellent lightsaber combat sim that was Jedi Academy. Jeffrey's presidency and the policies he enacted as president would lead to the high point in the history of LucasArts, and in turn contribute to the wider golden age of early to mid-2000s gaming. At this point in its history, LucasArts had created a multitude of games in various genres: platformers, space sims, real-time strategy, shooters, even a racing game. But although Star Wars the role-playing game had existed as far back as 1987, that was tabletop. Never before had there been a Star Wars video game RPG. And so, for LucasArts' first dive into those hitherto uncharted waters, Jeffries reached out to a then up-and-coming Canadian developer named BioWare. Founded by a trio of medical graduates from the University of Alberta, as well as a few of their friends and family, BioWare's RPG pedigree was already well established by the time Jeffries made his offer. Being big devotees of tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons, The developers of BioWare had already begun to court attention and success with the release of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 and Neverwinter Nights. However, it was the wild success of Knights of the Old Republic in late 2003 that would elevate BioWare to the status of a household name, and, alongside Bethesda Software, one of the reigning titans of Western RPGs. For better or for worse, without KOTOR, there may not have been a Jade Empire, or a Dragon Age Origins, or a Mass Effect. Around this time, The Phantom Menace was already out, and Attack of the Clones was in the works. So Lucasfilm gave BioWare one of two choices. They could set their RPG during the Clone Wars as a tie-in to the upcoming movie, or they could set it during the Old Republic era, which up till this point had only been touched upon in the Tales of the Jedi comic by Tom Veitch and Kevin Anderson. BioWare went with the Old Republic setting for reasons of greater creative freedom. Originally, they wanted to call it Age of the Jedi, but Lucasfilm rejected the idea as being too similar to Return of the Jedi, and proposed instead Knights of the Old Republic. Of course, nearly all the concepts for characters, their designs, the setting, and so forth had to go to Skywalker Ranch and receive the approval of George Lucas himself. Much to the surprise of BioWare co-founder Ray Muzica, though, apparently Lucas just approved of almost everything they did, only suggesting the most minor of alterations, which they were more than happy to oblige. On the technical side, both graphics and mechanics were handled by the brand new Odyssey engine, essentially a heavily modified of the old Aurora engine BioWare had used on Neverwinter Nights, while the character animations were done using an early version of Autodesk 3ds Max. That said, despite the popular mythology, LucasArts had an important role in the creation of Knights of the Old Republic. It wasn't just BioWare and a few LucasArts overseers. While BioWare was in charge of programming and visuals, LucasArts was in charge of the sound of KOTOR. LucasArts took charge of casting and directing the voice actors, handled sound design, and provided the soundtrack, composed by Jeremy Sewell, already a veteran composer of some note in video gaming. Having started out doing test work on the soundtrack of Final Fantasy VI, by the time he worked on KOTOR, he'd already provided soundtracks for the Total Annihilation series, as well as some Harry Potter games, the aforementioned Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights for BioWare, and Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. After KOTOR, he would continue providing music for various Harry Potter games, as well as the Company of Heroes and Guild Wars series, Dawn of War, and Elder Scrolls Oblivion and Skyrim. Other prominent people involved in development are Casey Hudson, who held the dual roles of director and producer, Derek Watts, who was in charge of the art, and the writer of KOTOR, Drew Karpyshyn, who would go on to write the stories for Mass Effect 1 and 2, but not 3, as well as, in my opinion, the second best Star Wars books ever written, the Darth Bane trilogy. After an initial late 2002 release was delayed, Knights of the Old Republic finally hit the stores on July 16, 2003. Both for the PC, because that's what BioWare had originally done, and Xbox, because of all the consoles it was the one they were the most familiar with. The PC version shot to the number 3 bestseller during its debut week. The first shipment of the Xbox version, 250,000 copies estimate, sold out in 4 days. Ordinary gamers and critics alike practically trampled over each other to heap every praise under the yellow sun onto this game. By the time Obsidian released the sequel a year later, KOTOR had already ascended to a place of untarnished excellence in the hearts and minds of Star Wars fans everywhere. So much for the backstory. Let's get down to business. Why Knights of the Old Republic should be canon. The game opens in classic movie fashion, which is appropriate as BioWare was going for a cinematic experience, and the title crawl does its job of filling us in on what we need to know. It's 4,000 years prior to the rise of the Empire, there's a big war going on between the Sith and the Republic, and the Sith are winning despite the fact that they've just lost their leader Darth Revan, as his successor, Darth Malak, has done an excellent job of filling his evil shoes. Then, in an obvious tribute to A New Hope, the first sight we see after the title crawl is a pan down to a planet's surface, followed by a ship entering from screen right while being fired upon by the enemy. It would seem that the Republic hammerhead cruiser, the Endar Spire, is not long for this world, and its death throes make for a very rude awakening for the player character.
We've been ambushed by a Sith battle fleet. The Endar Spire is under attack. Hurry up, we don't have much time.
Trask Ulgo is voiced by veteran voice actor Cam Clark, a man with a filmography that is too long to even summarize. His most famous roles being Liquid Snake from the Metal Gear series, Kaneda in the original, admittedly horrible English dub of Akira, and Leonardo and Rocksteady from the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon from the 80s. I don't know why, but this introductory sequence made me snigger the first time I saw it. The game's story starts in media res, with the player character literally waking up in the middle of the action. This guy walks in and tells you what the mission is, and then starts telling you what buttons to push in order to proceed. I don't know, maybe it's because I've seen the Blood Dragon tutorial too many times.
Ah, for fuck's sake.
Jump if you wish to jump.
Spider, I hate you.
Crouch to go lower.
Just let me kill people, damn it.
Anyway, according to Trask, the mission is to get to the bridge and support Bastila Shan, the Jedi Knight who's technically in charge of this mission, whatever that is. The two soldiers manage to fight their way to the bridge, only to find there's no Jedi. Assuming that Bastila headed for the escape pods, they go that way as well, only to be confronted by a far less friendly Force user.
I'll try to hold him off. You get to the escape pods. Go!
Ah yes, the companion character who dies in the first mission. A time-honored BioWare tradition. By the time the protagonist reaches the escape pods, it's just him and another Republic soldier named Cartho Nassi left. Unsurprisingly, escape pods aren't exactly made for maneuverability, so their escape from the Endar Spire ends in a really rough landing. After a mysterious dream-cum vision of a Jedi fighting a Sith, the protagonist awakens in a Taris City apartment, and Cartho Nassi, voiced by Raphael Zbarge, Caden Alenko from Mass Effect, brings him and the player up to speed on the situation. They are currently hiding in an abandoned apartment in the upper city of Taris, an ecumenopolis on the Outer Rim. Currently, the occupying Sith have the entire population under quarantine and a blockade in orbit ready to shoot down anyone who doesn't have the proper codes. All this in their efforts to hunt down the Jedi Bastila Shan. Why? Because Bastila possesses one of the rarest and most powerful of Jedi abilities, battle meditation. Essentially the old Jedi mind trick on a geometric scale, battle meditation can be used to influence the will and mental state of entire armies, strengthening the resolve of allies and weakening the fighting spirit of enemies. As such, Bastila is a one-woman military asset for the Republic, and something that the Sith would very much like to deprive the Republic of. Fortunately, the Sith have no idea where she is. Unfortunately, no one else does either. The closest thing Carth has to a lead is the possibility that Bastila's escape pod might have landed in the Undercity. So, the mission for our pair of heroes is simple but daunting. Find Bastila before the Sith do, and then find some way of sneaking off of Taris without being shot down.
Just remember to keep a low profile. I've heard some grim stories about the Dark Jedi interrogation techniques. They say the Force can do terrible things to a mind. It can wipe away your memories and destroy your very identity.
Much like Coruscant, Taris is all one big city, roughly divided into strata. The upper city, where the rich and most respectable law-abiding citizens live. The lower city, which is mostly inhabited by the poor and various criminal groups like swoop gangs. And finally, the Undercity, a warren of tunnels and caves inhabited by savage mutants known as rock ghouls, who, werewolf style, bite people and thus infect them with a virus that turns them in turn into rock ghouls. The Undercity is inhabited solely by fugitives, criminals who've been exiled down there by the authorities, mostly in the Upper City, and, most unfortunately, the descendants of both. Upper City Tarisians tend to be pretty smug and elitist, literally looking down on those from the lower levels. As if that weren't bad enough, the ancient Sith, much like the Galactic Empire thousands of years later, has a very strong human supremacist bias, and are especially hostile towards aliens. I guess some things never really do change. Speaking of aliens, KOTOR does feature a rather diverse palette of famous Star Wars aliens, and most of whom you meet for the first time on Taris. There are the Twi'leks, who are the only race apart from the humans who have both a male and female character model. There are also Duros, Rhodians, Aqualish, Weequays, the occasional Hutt, and even an Ithorian or two. Luckily, it's not that hard for Karth and the protagonist to find an elevator that would take them down to the Undercity. Unfortunately, it's heavily guarded by Sith troopers, and unless you are abiding by the new dress code, you're not going down anytime soon. Which kind of brings me to the issue of story pacing, which is very hard to judge in a video game like KOTOR. Even if the levels are small, especially compared to the sandbox levels of games today, KOTOR boasts a lot of open world elements. Now obviously as the player, you are free to basically literally play this however you like. You can afford to spend time on every single side quest if you want to go for a full completionist run. And this is where I have to give a lot of credit to writer Drew Karpyshyn here, because in a story with a more urgent plot, a semi-open world format would be to the detriment of the story. However, crucially, throughout the majority of Knights of the Old Republic, you are searching, either for people or things. And you're never given all the information you need to immediately find those people or things up front. So it actually makes sense narratively for you to spend time exploring and asking around. That said, so that this video doesn't take over 5 hours, I'm going to stick to the main plot and pretty much ignore all side quests except the ones relevant to the various companion characters that the player picks up along the way. One last thing before I return to the story proper. As city planets go, Taris is kind of uninspired. Now, in fairness, one, this isn't entirely BioWare's fault, this is just a result of the limitations of the graphics technology of the time. And two, this is less an issue with Star Wars and more an issue with science fiction in general, as with rare exceptions, most sci-fi cities tend to look the same. They almost always have the same mid-20th century utilitarian look to them. As such, while it is distinct in appearance from the other planets you visit in the game, Taris ultimately comes off looking like a dollar store Coruscant. Eventually, our heroes do finally find a lead after they rescue an Aqualish from being harassed by a pair of Sith troopers. Apparently, he was smuggling uniforms down to the lower city in support of the Hidden Becks, one of the swoop gangs who has decided to take up arms against the Sith occupation. Unfortunately, he has already given his last shipment of supply to the Becks, so he has no uniforms to spare himself, but fortunately, there is a pair of freshly made Sith corpses that Karth and the protagonist can loot. Uniforms in hand, so to speak, the two troopers bluff their way past the Sith guards, and after fighting their way through some gangsters in the lower city, they head for the cantina to gain some information, where they have the first of several fateful encounters.
Go away.
Kimba no kumixat abong kakincha nawabagaon tung abashun ni chunki
Kipuna! Gavatumpa kulpaiya mokapaata! Jiyoka kutumpa kulpaiya! One.
Oscar Chiska Nichu the Hupa Botenia go GGPT
Kipuna! Gavatumpa kulpaiya mukapata! Jiyokaku tumpa kupelea.
Two.
Jiyokaku Kimba muli ratwanaji Kuyami Juski Ichika Nai Uba Baska Dwana Chichopa Muska Jiska da Soki Kupa Bona na Chachu
Tune pudu. Rananu prata donko shirkasha. Jum apike.
Three.
No! No!
Apparently, if you try to talk to Calo Nord, he just does the same countdown thing until you either take the hint and stop, or he reaches 3 and kills you. Luckily, the second encounter is a bit more friendly, as our two heroes encounter a chatty teenage Twi'lek girl named Mission Veo being threatened by a pair of thugs until her best friend Zalbar intervenes, because everybody gangster until a Wookiee joins the chat. Mission is voiced by Catherine Tabor, another voice actor with an impressive resume, though most Star Wars fans will recognize her as the voice of Padme Amidala in the Clone Wars series. Unlike the bounty hunter, she is very friendly and more than happy to bring Karth and the protagonist up to speed on affairs in the lower city. Specifically of the rivalry between the two prominent swoop gangs, the Hidden Becks, led by Gadon Thek, and the Black Vulkars, led by Gadon's former protege, Brejik. Being a criminal gang leader notwithstanding, Gadon was very much a man of the people kind of guy. Almost a Star Wars version of the Godfather. Especially now as he resists the current Sith occupation just as he opposed the Mandalorian occupation back in the prequel comic. Brejik had served under him and, after Gadon lost his sight in an accident, had expected his mentor to step aside and give him the reins of the gang. When Gadon refused in the belief that Brejik was still not yet ready, the younger man effectively rage-quit the Hidden Becks, took over the Black Vulkars, and, apparently a spiteful bastard, has ever since waged a war of extermination upon his old gang, making the Vulkars essentially the Star Wars equivalent of the Goodfellas. For those of you who haven't realized it yet, I actually read the prequel comic before I ever had my first playthrough of KOTOR, which is why, if you've seen my videos on the comic, I failed to recognize Mission or Gadon as characters from the game, and why specifically I mispronounced Gadon Thek's name. I believe I called him Gadon Thek. Anyway, like the Aqualish above ground, Mission recommends that Gadon is the guy to talk to if you have a problem and need some help. With no better option in mind, Karth and the protagonist head over to the Hidden Beck base and find that Gadon Thek is indeed willing to oblige for a price. Gadon is voiced by Phil Lamar, another actor with a ridiculously long filmography, including but not limited to Hermes from Futurama, Static Shock, Samurai Jack, and Phoebus from Hunchback of Notre Dame, oddly enough. Anyway, he reveals that the Black Vulkars got to Bastila's escape pod before anyone else could, including the Sith. Fortunately, Bastila has not been recognized as a Jedi. As far as the Becks and the Vulkars know, she's just a Republic officer. The deal Gadon Thek offers is as follows. There's a big inter-gang swoop race coming up, and it's common knowledge by now that Brejik plans to put up Bastila as his share of the prize to whoever wins it. Recently, the Black Vulkars stole a prototype accelerator that the Becks were working on, obviously intending to use it to ensure their victory. With this victory, Brejik is planning to bring some of the smaller gangs under his wing, and thus have the superior numbers he needs to finally exterminate the Becks once and for all. Gadon's plan is that the two Republic troopers break into the Black Vulkar base and steal back the accelerator. With it, they can easily win the swoop race and secure Bastila's freedom. Obviously, the Vulkar base is heavily guarded. Fortunately, Gadon Thek knows someone who knows a back way in, Mission Veo, the chatty Twi'lek girl from the cantina. Unfortunately, by now she and Zalbar have gone down to the Undercity for shits and giggles in spite of the desperate scavengers and the roving packs of rat ghouls. Joy. After trading in the Sith uniforms for some official documents that Gadon assures Karth and the protagonist will get them past the Sith guards to the elevator to the Undercity, our two heroes are off to ramble among the rat ghouls. But not before they have their third and final significant encounter in the lower city. Not all criminals or even criminal gangs are created equal, and in Taris the real big shot is a kingpin named Davik Kang, who among other things extracts tribute from the various other gangs of Taris, including the Black Vulkars. On their way to the Undercity elevator, the two Republic troopers encounter a pair of Vulkars angrily disputing with one of Davik's emissaries over payment. That is, until said emissary summons backup in the form of a grizzled Mandalorian mercenary, at which point the Vulkars proceed to soil themselves and hand over the money. Funny thing is, I actually expected the Undercity to be like the lower city, but worse. You know, the same corridors and halls, only even more cramped and dark. Instead, most of the Undercity level is essentially a giant cave. It was kind of weird at first, but then recalling Darth Maul's Shadowhunter, the Undercity of Coruscant allowed for massive canyons and a worm the size of a whale. While a few assholes try to shake our heroes down for money, most of the Undercity folk are fairly decent people, or at least as decent as they can be given their conditions. After all, not only do they have to scrounge to survive amidst the literal detritus of the world above, they live in perpetual fear of the rat ghouls. And the Undercity community features essentially a quarantine zone where they pen up anyone bitten by a rat ghoul or suspected of being bitten by one. Then it's just a question of waiting to see whether they change or not. Pretty grim, all things considered. Fortunately, it's not hard to find Mission Veo. Unfortunately, Zalbar has been captured by Gamorrean slavers, and she's not helping anybody until her best friend is liberated. Fortunately, Gamorreans, and Wookiees for that matter, are a little too big and bulky to hide very effectively, especially in such tight confines as the sewers. Eventually, after killing a bunch of slavers and rat ghoul packs, Zalbar is indeed liberated, and the Wookiee is so grateful that he actually swears a life debt to the protagonist on the spot. His life is now bonded to that of the protagonist until one or both of them dies, and Wookiees, lest you forget, can live for centuries. At any rate, with Big Z safe, Mission upholds her end of the deal and gives the heroes their way inside the Vulcar base via the back door. This involves killing a few more Gamorreans and rat ghouls, and getting past a giant, hungry Rancor. Turns out the most effective way is to conceal a grenade inside one of the Rancor's dead corpses that it uses as food, and then applying some odor that is very attractive to the monster, essentially inducing it to consume a live explosive with predictable results. There isn't that much to say about the Vulcar base itself, and this again is not an indictment of BioWare so much as it is an acknowledgement of the lack of resources they had back then compared to what most game designers have today. Suffice to say though, once you've seen the inside of one compound full of enemies in KOTOR, you've seen most if not all of them. There is one brief dialogue encounter where one of Brejik's lackeys tries to get you to switch sides. And apparently you can accept this offer, assassinate Gadon Thek, and then enter the swoop race for the Black Vulcars. Of course, I am going by what was until Disney, the canon version of the story. So of course, all Black Vulcars must die. With that, our heroes have the prototype accelerator, and it's literally off to the races. Apparently, the swoop race minigame exists in multiple locations throughout KOTOR, but this is the only point where it actually is relevant to the plot. The objective here is to get the fastest time out of everyone else, and of course the protagonist wins because he is just that. And of course, because Brejik is the kind of character that he is, he refuses to hand over Bastila as the prize. Apparently he does this even if the player chooses to betray the hidden Becks and join the Vulcars. Which kind of begs the question, why offer a branch in the narrative like this when it's going to come back around like the Habsburg family tree? Brejik is voiced by Nathan Carlson, and where I expected him to sound, deep and kind of thuggish, instead his voice sounds like this.
You old fool! Your traditions are nothing to me. I am the wave of the future. If I want to withdraw the prize and sell this woman on the slave market myself, nobody can stop me.
I might have something to say about that, Brejik.
What? Impossible. You were restrained by a neural disruptor. How could you have possibly summoned the will to free yourself?
You underestimate the strength of a Jedi's mind, Brejik. A mistake you won't live to regret.
Vulcars, to me! Kill this woman! Kill the swoop rider! Kill them all!
And thus we are properly introduced to Bastila Shan, voiced by Jennifer Hale, possibly the most prolific female voice actor in gaming, with a filmography that is the most ridiculously long yet, albeit mostly in secondary or minor roles barring the occasional exception. Apart from Bastila, her most iconic role remains that of female Commander Shepard from Mass Effect. Bastila seems both surprised at the protagonist's presence and more than a little offended by the idea that she ever needed any help freeing herself from the Black Vulkars. However, ungrateful Jedi are the least of our heroes' concerns. After returning to the relative safety of their upper city apartment, the protagonist has another dream-come vision of Bastila, this time confronting the evil Darth Revan himself, just before the bridge of the ship they're on is hit by laser fire. And I really have to give credit to the animators who were working on this game at the time, especially given the low graphical quality they had to deal with. As Bastila crouches over the presumably mortally wounded Sith Lord, they actually somehow make her face go from determined to compassionate and even pitying. Anyway, when the protagonist relays this vision to Bastila, she seems more than a little disturbed, as it seems to suggest that the hero of our story has strong force sensitivity. But at the moment, that has to be put on the back burner. After all, there are far more pressing and immediate concerns. Technically, finding Bastila was the easy part of the plan. Now they have to find a way to get off Taris without being shot down by the Sith blockade. Luckily, becoming Swoop Champion and taking out the leadership of the Black Vulkars are the kind of accomplishments that gets one noticed on Taris, and a convenient informant approaches the heroes with word that someone might have a solution to their transport problem. Thus, we are finally properly introduced to Canderous Ordo, Davik Kang's Mandalorian troubleshooter, voiced by the late John Saigon, who's been, among other things, Solidus Snake from Metal Gear, various roles in the Mafia franchise, and Dash Rendar in some of the earlier Star Wars video games. Having heard of the protagonist's recent feats and deciding that his job arrangement with Davik is no longer to his liking, Canderous has a deal to offer. If our heroes can steal the recognition codes for the Sith blockade, he'll provide the ship with which they can escape. By provide, I mean steal Davik Kang's ship, the Ebon Hawk. Of course, getting into the Sith base means getting entry codes. Luckily, Davik has recently had repaired an astromech droid who has those codes programmed into it. A little bit of name dropping and persuasion with the local droid repairwoman, and T3M4 joins the team. Honestly, the best part about T3 is his design. It's actually one of the best in the entire game. You can clearly recognize that it is an astromech of some kind, but his design also has this archaic feel to it to make you think, yes, this is a precursor to R2-D2, reminding you that this is 4,000 years before the original trilogy. Unfortunately, T3's design is the only good thing about him because for some baffling reason, he is the only companion character that is given no personality. You try talking to him at any point in the game and all he does is just beeps and boops at you. Later, the only thing he's really good for is creating computer spikes for the slicing minigame. I don't know if this was another cut corner on the part of BioWare, once again showing how stretched their resources were, but it really seems like a missed opportunity. After breaking into the Sith base and leaving bad guy bodies everywhere like the garbage they are, our heroes do indeed retrieve the codes that will get them past the Armada. And Canderous starts holding up his end of the bargain by getting the protagonist in to have a meeting with Davik Kang, supposedly under the guise of wanting to join Davik's organization. Unbeknownst to everybody else, up in orbit aboard his flagship, the evil Darth Malak, voiced by Raphael Ferrer, remains obsessed with either capturing or eliminating Bastila and her battle meditation from the game board. And so he orders his admiral, Saul Karath, voiced by the late Robin Sachs, to prepare for an orbital bombardment of Taris itself. Karath briefly protests on the grounds that 1, that will result in a lot of civilian casualties, and 2, it will kill a lot of their own forces down on the surface, but Malak reminds him that it is never a wise policy to make a Sith Lord repeat himself, and the renegade admiral acquiesces. Weirdly enough, despite Malak being a fairly prominent and recognizable role, especially given the success of KOTOR, it seems that Raphael Ferrer never really had any significant voice acting roles before or since. Malak really is the be-all end-all of his entire career as far as I've been able to find. By contrast, Robin Sachs has had multiple roles, some of them even prominent ones. He was Zaid Masani in Mass Effect 2 and 3, And he starred opposite Tim Allen in Galaxy Quest as the evil alien warlord Saris. Completely oblivious to all this, Candaris arranges the meeting with the protagonist and Davik Kang, voiced by Charles Dennis, and we have a second encounter with bounty hunter Calo Nord, voiced by Lloyd Scher, who would eventually go on to play the father in the Clone Wars TV series. Of course, the minute Davik Kang leaves them alone, our heroes begin busting heads and eventually make it to the hangar, right at the moment that the Sith begin their bombardment of Taris. Of course, they run into Davik and Calo Nord attempting to make their own escape, and the Kingpin goes down pretty easily. For his part, Calo attempts to blow everyone up with a thermal detonator, and then part of the hangar roof collapses on him, leaving our ragtag band of unlikely allies a clear run at the Ebon Hawk. The Ebon Hawk takes off just in time as, under Malak's orders, the Sith fleet completely lays waste to Taris. It's not quite Alderaan level destroyed, but certainly the civilian casualties would have been horrific. Malak essentially burned down an entire house just to kill one flea, and the flea escaped anyway. It's a solid establishing villain moment for Malak, and in fact the destruction of Taris is something that various NPCs throughout the game will bring up over and over, reinforcing the idea that this is a consequential moment. Our heroes make it past the Sith blockade without a hitch, and though there is a brief dogfight with some Sith fighters, the Ebon Hawk gets away free and clear. And at Bastila's suggestion, they make way for the Jedi Academy on Dantooine. Ah, Dantooine. That planet Leia basically offered up as a sacrifice to Tarkin in the hopes that he would spare Alderaan. The planet has appeared in multiple storylines, mostly in the books, but as far as I know, the earliest appearance of the planet, as in an actual visual depiction, was an old gimmicky Star Wars comic, a 3D comic, by Marvel in the 1970s. Unfortunately, I've been unable to find any images from said comic, so I have no idea if its depiction of Dantooine matches that of Knights of the Old Republic. Anyway, apart from the Jedi Academy itself, Dantooine seems to be mostly the savannah, as I swear those fat-looking trees you see on the plains are supposed to be like baobab trees from Africa. Speaking of the scenery, here I must give my first shout out to composer Jeremy Soule. KOTOR really is a product of an earlier time in gaming, back when they lacked the money and/or the technology to really incorporate full orchestral scores, even though by this point they had firmly left 8-bit and 16-bit music behind them. So Soule had kind of an uphill battle here to give the soundtrack the same sweeping scope and grandeur that Star Wars calls for with the limited resources at his disposal. There's also the fact that as a video game, most of the music is on a loop depending on what area you're in or whether or not you're in a combat situation. If listening to the same tune in the background over and over again annoys you, you know the composer has failed in his primary objective. For my money, most of the initial tracks are pretty standard turn of the millennia video game music. For me, Dantooine is where the soundtrack really starts to sound and feel like Star Wars. The Jedi Academy theme in particular conveys a very relaxed, peaceful feeling, appropriate after all the hectic mess back on Taris. Of course, our heroes have no time to take in the sights and sounds of Academy life, as our protagonist is due for a meeting with the Jedi Council. The Council on Dantooine consists of 4 members. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find out who the voice actors were for the Twi'lek Jar Leston, who does most of the actual training here, and Master Dorak, the chronicler and historian of the Council. For some reason, voice actor information is almost impossible to find unless you voiced a main character in this game. Meanwhile, a Yoda species master, Vandar Tokar, is voiced by Tom Clark, who would go on to voice, among other things, both Yoda and Admiral Yularen in the Clone Wars series. In particular, his Yoda impression is so good you could be forgiven for mistaking it for the original voice of Yoda, Frank Oz. The 4th and final member of the council, Master Vrook Lamar, meanwhile, is voiced by longtime Hollywood luminary, the late Ed Asner. This man was doing voice acting back when radio was still the biggest entertainment medium in the country, if not the world. His film career stretches from the 60s, when he starred opposite John Wayne in El Dorado, to Up in the late 2010s. Even now, almost 2 decades after KOTOR came out, Asner kind of remains the most prestigious name out of all the voice cast. Anyway, his principal role here is to serve as the skeptic on the Jedi Council. While the other Masters on the Council are seriously considering inducting the protagonist into the Order due to his strong sensitivity to the Force, Master Lamar is the one who is most doubtful of whether or not this is the wisest move to take. However, after the protagonist and Bastila share a Force vision, this time of Malak and presumably Revan, beginning their quest in search of something called the Star Forge, the Council decides that the best thing to do is at least prepare the protagonist for what is to come. Clearly there is a strong connection in the Force between him and Bastila, and they can't simply ignore it. Cue the training montage.
The path you have chosen to walk is difficult. Intensive training will prepare you physically for the demands of the Order. Meditation will teach you to channel the power of the Force. To truly understand the way of the Jedi, you must open your mind to knowledge. Seek wisdom in the teachings of the great masters of our Order. A Jedi is never alone. Others in the Order will always stand by you. You and Bastila share a special bond. Do not be afraid to turn to her when you need help in your training. The way of the Jedi is difficult. It requires great discipline. Yet even though you are a mere apprentice, your potential is unlimited, and your progress amazing. In all my years, I have never seen one who has mastered the initial training so quickly. You have done in weeks what many cannot do in years. I am honored to welcome you fully into the Jedi Order.
Of course, not all the training is done in a single cutscene. Master Jar gives the protagonist 3 final tests. The first is a recitation of the Jedi Code. Funnily enough, the origins of the Jedi Code go all the way back to early drafts of The Empire Strikes Back. One of the many things that, like in most films, ended up on the cutting room floor was a moment where Luke would recite something akin to an oath before going off to Bespin. Meanwhile, the oldest reference to the code that we know, which mostly reads like a mantra, goes back to Heir to the Empire, where Luke has a memory of Yoda saying, "For the Jedi, there is no emotion, there is peace." Meanwhile, the full Jedi Code made its first appearance in the Golden Age of the Sith comic, and in the lore was originally codified by Master Odon This, of course, is the version that Master Jar tests the protagonist on, with the additional line of, "There is no chaos, there is harmony." The second test is basically a personality quiz delivered by Master Doorak, and its purpose is to decide what Jedi player class the protagonist takes. Reaching back to the original Star Wars role-playing game, depending on the player's answers, you might be suited to either be the combat-focused Jedi Guardian, the Jack-of-all-trades Jedi Sentinel, or the Jedi Consular, which specializes in social interaction and the more esoteric powers of the Force. And even then, apparently you can just ignore the verdict of the test and pick whichever class you like. In KOTOR, the initial color of your lightsaber indicates your class: blue for Guardian, yellow for Sentinel, green for Consular. And Master Doorak hands over a crystal whose color corresponds to the player's class choice. At which point, the protagonist assembles his first lightsaber. The third and final test is a bit more complicated. Some strange dark side influence has been causing problems out in the countryside, specifically agitating the local predators called Kath Hounds, making them far more feral and likely to attack without provocation. The final test, therefore, is for the protagonist to find the source of this dark side corruption and deal with it as best he can with his training and talent. Eventually, this source of corruption turns out to be a renegade Cathar Padawan named Juhani, who has fallen to the dark side after suddenly killing her master in a rage. She's turned this old sacred grove out on the plains into essentially her lair, steeping it in her newfound connection to the dark side, which is of course the source of all the problems. Naturally, she is quite hostile to the protagonist and his companions, and they have to beat her down a little before they can even begin trying to reason with her. Juhani is voiced by Courtney Taylor, who's done voice acting for various mediums but has mostly been a video game voice actor. Juhani was in fact one of her earliest roles. She would go on to play, among other things, both Damsel and Heather Poe from Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines and Jack in Mass Effect 2. After some conversing, it turns out that Juhani's fall to the dark side was precipitated as much by self-loathing and self-blame as anything else. As a Padawan, Juhani had always struggled to control her emotions. So when she finally lashed out in anger and struck down her teacher, Master Quattro, in a training exercise, her thought processes were that she's essentially past a point of no return. This proved that she was a failure as a Jedi. Maybe she could at least make a decent Sith. Only she's now just lost to this random stranger, so what now? Here, the player makes the first, actually consequential choice in the storyline. Persuade Juhani to renounce the dark side, or kill her and put her out of her misery. You have a total of 9 companion characters in Knights of the Old Republic. The first 6 from Taris, Karth, Bastila, Canderous, Mission, Zalbar, and T3 are necessary and mandatory. You cannot so much as leave Taris without them all. There is one other companion character who joins your party whether you want him to or not later in the game, but Juhani is one of 2 that is completely optional. You can in fact complete the game after killing her. There is one other significant consequence from killing Juhani in the story, but I'll bring that up later when it's more relevant. The protagonist is able to persuade Juhani to renounce the dark side and return to the light, mostly by insisting that so long as she sincerely wants to, she can achieve redemption and even forgiveness. There is always hope, especially in the Star Wars universe. So long as there's sincerity, one can always change for the better. The ticket to the future is always open. With that, Juhani is convinced and the dark side taint is cleansed. Master Jar later reveals that Juhani's instructor Quattro is still very much alive, and that she only faked her death as a way to test her Padawan's character, which personally seems kinda messed up to me, but oh well. Now, fully inducted into the Jedi Order, the hero is sent by the Council to explore that strange temple ruin that he and Bastila saw in their shared vision. Where the Jedi Academy, and indeed most of Dantooine, has this air of peace and contemplation, the strange ruins are dark, shadowy, and creepy. Full credit to the designers at BioWare, especially with the limited graphics technology they had back then, because it really does feel like it doesn't belong on a place like Dantooine, that it was planted here by someone else, someone not of this world. Inside, the party finds the corpse of the last Jedi sent to investigate the ruins, and a droid so ancient it's constantly quivering like it's about to fall to pieces at any moment. Which wouldn't be surprising given that, if the droid's claims are to be believed, it's been active for many thousands of years. Unfortunately, this droid was not programmed much for intelligence beyond what it needed to oversee the ruins, so its information is limited. It makes oblique references to a strange elder race known as the Builders, who once ruled a vast empire and enslaved many other different species, although apparently the droid thinks that the empire still exists, and that they created this thing called the Star Forge. Though again, the droid can't really say anything much about it apart from the fact that it was the crowning achievement of the Builders. The droid recognizes our heroes neither as builders nor as slaves, but like those from before, obviously Revan and Malak. And Bastila speculates that it was the search for the Star Forge that began Revan and Malak's slide into evil. After passing a test that sounds like a basic quiz about terraforming, the secret at the heart of the temple is revealed, an ancient star map. So ancient, in fact, that it is degraded, and alas, provides no clear direction as to where the Star Forge might be found, whatever that is. There are, however, clues, as 4 specific planets are highlighted on the map: Tatooine, Kashyyyk, Manaan, and Korriban. After this information is relayed to the Council, they decide that the best course of action is to send the protagonist to investigate these 4 worlds and see if they can find any clues that might lead them to the Star Forge. Whatever it is, it clearly plays an important role in the Sith war effort. Perhaps by finding the Star Forge, he might find a way to stop the Sith once and for all. Of course, Bastila will go with him because of the strong connection that they share in the Force. And apparently Juhani is along for the ride as well, as she has requested to join our heroes and the council has acquiesced. The other companions for Taris are along for the ride as well. Karth, as a Republic soldier, is eager to oppose the Sith in any way. Mission, Zalbar, and T3 really have nowhere else to go after the bombardment of Taris, while Canderous figures that opposing the Sith means fighting strong opponents, which, as a Mandalorian, he is always down for. Of course, this party has to be small and unobtrusive. Sending an elite team of Jedi Knights searching after the Starforge would only draw the Sith's attention and ensure its failure. It's essentially the Fellowship of the Ring approach, which is apropos given that the Peter Jackson trilogy began premiering in theaters in 2001, 2 years before KOTOR's release. And the final film, Return of the King, would actually be released the same year, albeit 5 months later. So yeah, all the stuff on Taris and Dantooine, over 40 minutes into this video, one of the longest I've ever done thus far, was just the preamble. Now, the story proper actually begins.
You can leave whenever you wish. The sooner the better. The longer you wait, the stronger Malak becomes. But first, a warning, young Padawan. The lure of the dark side is difficult to resist. I fear this quest to find the Star Forge could lead you down an all too familiar path.
From this point on, you really can see how KOTOR sort of became the template for BioWare's own sci-fi franchise, Mass Effect. Dantooine functions as the main hub, like the Citadel. The Ebon Hawk obviously is a precursor to the Normandy, where you interact with most of your companion characters. And the main plotline is to investigate several different planets, slowly uncovering information that leads you to the final destination. Of course, as the player, the order of the 4 planets you visit is entirely up to you. I ultimately went with Kashyyyk, Tatooine, Manaan, Korriban. But a few final details before the heroes head out on their adventure. First, the protagonist is accosted by one Disra Lur Jada, who warns the protagonist against encountering something called a Tarentatek. Savage monsters with a particular predilection for the taste of Force-sensitive flesh and blood. Their origins are effectively forgotten in universe, but the Tarentateks actually originated during the dawn of the Jedi era, long before Force users even conceived of the idea of separating the light from the dark side of the Force. According to Disra, Exar Kun employed the use of Tarentateks during the Sith War. After that conflict's conclusion, the Jedi Order made an effort to wipe out the Tarentateks that survived, known as the Great Hunt, even though this cost many Jedi their lives, as Tarentateks are completely immune to Force powers. The second detail concerns the Ebon Hawk. Again, like the Normandy that would come after it, this is the primary setting of the game. It's where the protagonist interacts with the companion characters and learns more about them. Which is why it's kind of disappointing to say that the Ebon Hawk just doesn't look very impressive to me on a design level. It's obvious what BioWare was going for. Its basic shape is reminiscent enough of the Millennium Falcon to evoke familiarity, but unlike T3, whose design is a brilliant combination of the archaic and the familiar, the Ebon Hawk seems to lack anything of the former. Maybe this is again due to the limited graphical technology of the early 2000s, but the design just looks so bland, especially compared to a lot of other hero ships in sci-fi. There's of course the Millennium Falcon, Luke's X-Wing, or the Ravenclaw from Star Wars itself, but also other sci-fi franchises, like the Enterprise, the Serenity, Moya from Farscape, and of course, the Normandy. Speaking of companion characters, we come to the third detail before resuming the story proper. Building off of what it had done in prior games like Neverwinter Nights and Baldur's Gate 2, BioWare included in KOTOR several character-specific questlines. Well, except for T3 and one other character. This is something that BioWare would continue to develop over the course of its history, and in my opinion reach its peak in Mass Effect 2. As such, for the sake of coherence in this pretty lengthy video, I'm going to mostly cover the characters and their development during their respective quests. The two big exceptions to the rule here being Carth Onasi and Bastila Shan, as of all the companions, they play the most prominent role in the main plot. So it is worthwhile to talk about who they are and how they relate to the protagonist, at least up to this point in the story. Each of their character arcs involves issues they need to work through. For Carth, it's a combination of guilt and betrayal. A soldier to the core, Carth originally served during the Mandalorian Wars, mostly under Admiral Karath, whom he looked up to as a kind of mentor figure. Which, now that I look back on it, is something that John Jackson Miller singularly failed to convey in the prequel comic. Carth fought bravely alongside not just the rest of the Republic fleet, but also the Revan-kissed Jedi, including Revan and Malak themselves. Like most Republic citizens at the time, he looked up to the bold and brave Revan and his followers as heroes, the Jedi who dared defy the Council's unwillingness to take action and defend the Republic against the enemy. This, of course, made it all the more shocking when Revan and Malak fell to the dark side, seeming to betray everything they'd fought for. Nearly all of the Revan-kists and most of the Republic forces that had fought alongside them during the Mandalorian Wars turned with them, including Admiral Karath. After several conversations, Carth eventually tells the story of how Karath, before he left, approached him and tried to recruit him for the Sith. Carth refused, unable to conceive of the idea of his commanding officer seriously intending to betray the Republic. Although he denies it, it's clear from the way he talks about himself that Carth blames himself for failing to foresee Karath's betrayal. Had he known, he might have stopped Karath, and possibly saved a lot of lives that died as a result of the Admiral's defection to the Sith. As a result of this great betrayal, Carth has some serious trust issues. This even extends to a mistrust of his own allies. Back on Taris, multiple times he expressed mistrust and suspicion regarding the protagonist. Not out of a lack of trust for the latter specifically, but more out of a lack of trust for anyone. He also revealed that the protagonist's transfer to the Endar Spire's crew was a last-minute request by the Jedi, even though there was nothing exceptional about the protagonist at the time apart from an unusual gift for alien languages. The fact that he was the only one apart from Carth and Bastila to survive the attack on the Endar Spire only heightened the former's suspicions. They have fought together and endured many trials by fire up to this point, and yet, while Carth is grateful to the protagonist for helping keep them all alive up to this point, he still has doubts about him. And the recent developments on Dantooine have only increased them. No matter how innately talented in the Force the protagonist is, entrusting a mission of such importance to a neophyte Padawan is setting off warning bells in his wary mind. And the Council's excuse of helping maintain a low profile just doesn't cut the mustard with him. As for Bastila, at this point in the story, her chief concern is the bond between her and the protagonist, and whether or not they really might be able to take on Darth Malak and his Sith. That and being annoyed by the protagonist's early attempts to flirt with her. Honestly, even if I hadn't gone for the romance option, I would still have picked some of these dialogue options, as it's just so much fun to tease her about it.
You never give up, do you? I admit, I'm interested in you. I find you intriguing, compelling even, but it's not what you think. You have a great gift. You have an awesome command of the Force, and I tremble when I think of how you might misuse it. What? No, of course not. Not like that, anyway.
She does, however, reveal some pretty pertinent details early on. Namely the fact that, though she was involved in the fight against Darth Revan and even confronted the Sith Lord himself, despite what many have believed, she was not the one who killed him. In fact, she didn't try to kill him at all. Her intent had been to capture the Sith Lord alive, for then as now, Jedi don't really believe in executions most of the time. But Malak, ever the good Sith, saw an opportunity to take his master's place and fired upon the bridge of Revan's own ship, severely injuring him. Bastila doesn't elaborate on what exactly happened afterward. After a cutscene of the Ebon Hawk taking off from Dantooine, we cut back to the villains, where Malak and Karath are now fully aware of Bastila's survival, despite the bombardment of Taris, thanks entirely to Calo Nord. After surviving a hangar roof falling on him and an orbital bombardment, I'd swear the man is part cockroach. He's agreed to help the Sith capture Bastila for a hefty fee, but he's also relayed certain information to Karath. Information that Darth Malak himself might find interesting, but of course we don't know because that occurs off-screen. So, first destination, Kashyyyk. Technically, Kashyyyk, the Wookiee homeworld, first appeared in the infamous holiday special. Thanks to Chewbacca making the Wookiees the single most iconic race in all of Star Wars, Kashyyyk has correspondingly appeared in multiple different storylines, particularly in the comics and the books. But unless you were a hardcore comic book fan prior to 2003, Knights of the Old Republic was probably most Star Wars fans' first depiction, visually, of what Kashyyyk looks like. Revenge of the Sith was still 2 years away at the time. However, it's not the Wookiees who greet our heroes at the landing pad, but the representatives of the infamous corporation Czerka Arms, a company that specializes in manufacturing weapons and droids, strutting about as if they own the planet, which, as it turns out, they kind of do. They don't even have the decency to refer to the planet by its name, instead designating it Planet G5623 like it's just another asset on a balance sheet. Not content with doing a brisk business in droids and weapons, Czerka Arms, it seems, has decided to go into the slaving business, capturing and selling Wookiees into slavery, apparently with the consent and even approval of the local Wookiee chieftain Chundar. And here we come technically to the first companion quest, that for Zalbar, because in a way, the main plotline of Kashyyyk is his quest. Up to this point in the game, all the other companion characters have been willing to talk about themselves when prompted by the protagonist. Zalbar was the lone exception, insisting that there were certain things about him and his culture that the Padawan simply could never understand. The only details that he learned about Zalbar up to this point came from Mission. They'd first met when she saw the Wookiee being harassed by some thugs and tried to intervene, only for one of the thugs to knock her out. Zalbar, who could have kicked all their asses easily but had been trying not to provoke a fight, had then picked up the offender by the throat, at which point the others ran away in fear. They'd been best friends ever since. But even to Mission, Zalbar had relayed no details about his past. But now, with Czerka running roughshod over his world and his own people looking at him with hatred and disdain, the Wookiee has no choice but to finally come clean about himself. The village that the party is journeying to, Ruruk-Ruroro, another Heir to the Empire reference, is his home. Chundar, the local Wookiee chieftain, is his brother. Years ago, Zalbar discovered that Chundar had been making deals with Czerka, selling out his own people to the slavers. Enraged by this betrayal, Zalbar attacked his own brother and made the fateful mistake of using his climbing claws to do it. Kashyyyk has always been described and depicted in various Star Wars media as a forest planet. So when Timothy Zahn wrote Heir to the Empire, the first book in the Thrawn trilogy, which features Leia and Chewie spending time on Kashyyyk, he naturally figured that since the Wookiees are the natives of that world, they must have a means of climbing, and so he gave the Wookiees climbing claws. It was only after Heir to the Empire was published that Zahn and Lucasfilm in general realized that this caused a potential continuity problem. After all, Chewbacca never showed any claws in the original films. Luckily, West End Games, owners of the Star Wars RPG at the time, came to the rescue, writing in their supplementary source books that Wookiees considered the use of their climbing claws as weapons to be completely dishonorable, something that only a feral animal or a madman would do. And thus was invented the concept of the Mad Claw. Chundar was able to use this to successfully discredit Zalbar's accusations against him, and their father, the chieftain at the time, forced Zalbar into exile. Zalbar left Kashyyyk intending never to return. But now, thanks to his life debt to the Padawan, he has come home, in complete violation of the terms of his exile. It seems that in the interim, Chundar has succeeded their father as leader of the tribe. Chundar, a slimy and cunning bastard if ever there was one, has continued his partnership with Czerka Arms, allowing them free rein to exploit Kashyyyk's natural resources in exchange for minimizing the Wookiee slave raids. Of course, Chundar has continued to sell some Wookiees to them, usually political opponents of his, and his manipulation skills are such that he's able to hoodwink his own people into thinking that he is the only thing standing between them and evil outsiders. Because Zalbar has technically violated the terms of his exile by returning to Kashyyyk, Chundar is well within his rights to have his brother executed. But ever the opportunist, he decides instead to offer a deal to the Padawan and his friends. There's an insane old Wookiee down in the Shadowlands that Chundar wants the protagonist to eliminate for him. Do that, and he'll let them all leave Kashyyyk free and clear. Until then, Zalbar remains with him as his hostage. Not the best of terms, but according to a Force vision shared by the Padawan and Bastila, the star map that they're looking for is on the Force floor, which means in the Shadowlands. So for now, it might be best to play along with Chundar's scheme. And so the party finds a lift that takes them down to the Shadowlands of Kashyyyk. In the immortal words of Imperial Admiral Gilad Pelion, Kashyyyk's ecology can best be described as a layered death trap. The closer to the surface you go, the more light is blocked by the canopy above, and the more dangerous the flora and fauna. Unsurprisingly, the Wookiees stick to the safer upper levels, and only young males descend into the lower levels, either to perform rites of passage or to prove themselves as brave hunters. KOTOR features quite a few nasty critters. The bat-like Michaels, the arachnid-esque Kinraths, the savage Katarns, which are considered the deadliest predator on Kashyyyk, and perhaps the only truly harmless animal in the lower levels, the monkey-like Tax. Once again, Jeremy Soule does begin to deliver on the music. Kashyyyk has really two main ambient themes, the main Kashyyyk theme and the Shadowlands theme. The main theme is mostly tribal drums and flutes, which makes sense given the relatively simplistic lifestyle most Wookiees prefer. Even after being exposed to advanced technology, the Wookiees only use what little they felt would make their lives a bit easier. Otherwise, their way of life would remain unchanged for thousands of years. By contrast, the Shadowlands theme is more classical music, dark and menacing, which is appropriate given that the Shadowlands are basically a Warhammer-level death world, and you can't turn a corner without having to fight 4 or 5 predators. Then there's the matter of the dialogue, though. Most of the NPCs you interact with in-game speak Basic, but there are NPCs that speak in other languages, namely Huttese, which makes sense as most of the events of KOTOR take place in the Outer Rim, where the Hutts have strong influence. Of course, KOTOR provides a translation of what they're saying, but while it takes maybe 2 to 3 seconds to read the translation, the actual speech takes maybe 10 to 15 seconds. Granted, the game allows you to skip through the dialogue segments, but it's still quite a drag. And this is especially prominent on Kashyyyk, where everyone speaks the Wookiee language, Shriwook, and it's painfully obvious after the first conversation or so that they're just reusing and recombining the same half-dozen Chewbacca sound effects from the original trilogy. But not all predators on Kashyyyk walk on 4 or even 5 legs. Calo Nord has finally caught up to our heroes and is confident of an easy victory. But things have changed since Taris, and our hero has gotten a lot stronger. After a fierce fight, Calo Nord is dead, this time for sure. Luckily, the next encounter is a bit more friendly, as the party comes across an old eccentric, kind of but not quite Jedi named Jolee Bindo, voiced by Kevin Michael Richardson. This is another guy with a pretty extensive voice acting career, mostly in cartoons, though he has done a few film roles, Captain Gantu in Lilo and Stitch and Deus Ex Machina from The Matrix Revolutions. He's been in Static Shock, Megas XLR, The Proud Family, SpongeBob, Justice League, he was the Shredder in the 2012 Ninja Turtles, but I will always remember him best as the Guardian from Samurai Jack.
Nope.
Fortunately, Jolee knows exactly where to find the star map our heroes are looking for. Unfortunately, some Zerka poachers have set up a deflector shield blocking off the area where the star map might be found. Luckily, while the leader of the poachers is determined to carry out his orders and collect tack glands from the local wildlife, most of the rank-and-file Zerka people do not want to be here. The only thing keeping them safe from the savage predators of the Shadowlands are a series of sonic emitters surrounding their camp. And it turns out not to be too difficult for the Padawan to persuade the Zerka grunts to hand over the codes needed to deactivate those generators. With enough sonic emitters down, the Zerka people have no choice but to leave. Oh, how sad for them. Jolee deactivates the deflector shield, and after a bit more searching, the star map is finally found. At which point, writer Drew Karpyshyn and lead designer James Olin come dangerously close to giving the game away. Before they can access the star map, a weird computer activates. The computer's AI, which takes the form of an unknown alien, seems to recognize something in the Padawan, but demands confirmation first before it will allow the Padawan access to the star map. The test takes the form of a series of ethical questions, and apparently the right answers to those questions are the most evil and callous towards innocent life. Of course, having been trained in the Jedi ways by the Council on Dantooine, the Padawan gives merciful, good answers, and the computer sicks some droids on the party. The droids are quickly dismembered, and apparently analysis of the Padawan's neural activity during combat has caused the computer to turn over a new leaf and grant full access to the star map, though it refuses to explain why the change in attitude. It does, however, reveal an interesting detail, not relevant to the story per se, but certainly an interesting bit of lore. As was hinted by the test inside the weird temple on Dantooine, the mysterious builders were really into terraforming. The star map is an obvious indicator of their presence on Kashyyyk once in the distant past, and the computer reveals that this world was originally terraformed for agricultural purposes. Kashyyyk had already been a lush world rich in life. But as the builders' technology degraded with the passing of centuries, it overstimulated the growth of the native flora and fauna. This helps explain why Kashyyyk's forests are miles high and inhabited by so many savage predator species. Our heroes also encounter that crazed Wookiee Chundar had sent them down to kill, only to discover that he is Freyr, the former chieftain of Ruruk-Ruroro, and Chundar and Zalbar's father. Some time after Zalbar was exiled from Kashyyyk, he too discovered Chundar's dirty dealings with Zerka, only to be driven off by his traitorous son and his new allies. Like Zalbar before him, Freyr was branded a Madclaw and was forced to flee into the Shadowlands. Unfortunately, Freyr is a little too tough and hardy to just conveniently be eaten by the predators down there, which is why Chundar wanted the Padawan to kill him, thus eliminating a possible threat to his rule of Ruruk-Ruroro. After learning of Zalbar's return, Freyr is determined to take back his rightful place as chieftain and put an end to Chundar's rule. This will not be easy. Even if he is the former chieftain and Chundar's father, he has been branded a Madclaw, and Wookiees are pretty hidebound when it comes to their traditions. If he's going to retake his place as chieftain, he's going to need something to boost his credibility. The only thing he can think of that might help is the Blade of Baka, an ancient sword created by a founder hero of the Wookiee people. It was passed down from chieftain to chieftain for generations. Then one day in a ritual fight, the blade snapped off and became lodged in the hilt of a massive monster still lurking in the Shadowlands. Chundar still possesses the hilt, but if our heroes could regain the blade, Freyr could use it to turn some of the Wookiees to his side and overthrow his usurping son. The Padawan and his friends lure the ritual beast into the open with a freshly dead Kinrath, and after a long, hard fight, manage to slay it and retrieve the blade. Though no one yet knows it at the time, the ritual beast is in fact one of the Tarentataks the Padawan was warned about on Dantooine. After returning the Blade of Baka to Freyr and killing some of Chundar's loyalists guarding the lift, our heroes and the Wookiee chieftain confront Chundar, and with help from Zalbar, the traitor is killed and his Zerka allies with him. A victorious Freyr is restored as chieftain, rescinds Zalbar's exile, and resolves to take the fight to Zerka, driving them from their world forever. Zalbar, however, wishes to continue honoring his life debt to the Padawan and travel with him to find the Star Forge. And so his father gifts him with the newly restored Blade of Baka. In the alternate dark side version, you basically betray Freyr and Chundar stays chief, but Zalbar is still willing to accompany you on your quest. This is another instance of the narrative branching out only to loop back again, but at least it does make more sense here than back on Taris. After all, Zalbar is bound by life debt to the Padawan, and as such must follow him wherever he goes, even if Zalbar doesn't like it. The only part of the dark side choice that doesn't make sense to me is that Chundar gives Zalbar the Blade of Baka just like Freyr does in the light side choice. You'd think he'd want to hold on to such a powerful symbol as a way of strengthening his authority. And so our heroes depart for Tatooine, now accompanied by the eccentric Jolie Bindo. After living in the Shadowlands for so long all by himself, he's tired of forests and solitude and figures maybe his old bones can tolerate another adventure. At this point in Star Wars history, Tatooine has only recently been settled by Offworlders, and the Ebon Hawk lands at then the only major settlement on the planet, Anchorhead. The Padawan and Bastila share another vision of where the local star map might be found, this time apparently in some cave, presumably out in the desert. Once again, with nothing else to go on, they resort to asking the locals for any hints that might point them in the right direction. Give BioWare credit, Anchorhead does have that seamy-seedy feel that any population center on Tatooine seems required by law to have. It even features a few aliens that weren't previously encountered on Taris and Dantooine. Jawas, of course, some Gamorreans, even the occasional Bith. However, these being the early days of Tatooine settlement by Offworlders, this is also around the time where they're starting to have their first conflicts with the local Sand People. As such, it turns out most people are not allowed to exit Anchorhead and go out into the Dune Sea, the sole exception being registered and licensed hunters. The only place to acquire a hunting license is the local office of the ever-ubiquitous and ever-sleazy Zerka Corporation. With a little persuasion, the Padawan is able to obtain a hunting license from the local Zerka representative, who is also prepared to offer the Padawan a job. Zerka came to Tatooine in the first place because they heard there's good ore to be mined. Unfortunately, their operations have suffered constant attacks by the Sand People. The corporation, deeming the locals little more than animals because they can't speak an intelligible dialect, have put bounties out on the Tusken raiders. Any prospective takers must bring back Tusken gaffy sticks as proof of their kills, and an especially high reward is out for the gaffy stick of the local Tusken chief. After leaving the Zerka office, a Duro conservationist approaches the Padawan and informs him that there might be an alternative to killing the Tuskens. This is a fairly sound idea. Given that the Sand People are native to the Dune Sea, they're likely the only ones who might have any idea as to where the star map might be found. Of course, the Sand People are intensely hostile, viewing all outsiders as invaders, not just the Zerka miners. The big barrier to any communication with the Sand People, of course, is language, as they speak no dialect familiar to anyone in the known galaxy. The Duro suggests that the best bet our heroes have is acquiring a decent protocol droid, and that the best bet of acquiring that, in turn, is the droid shop belonging to an Ithorian named Yukalaka, although the Duro does admit that Yukalaka is something of a con man. Given that Tusken is one of the few languages that the multilingual protagonist does not in fact know, our heroes head off to the droid shop, and after some haggling, acquire the last companion character on the team, the one, the only, HK-47, voiced by Christopher Tabori, another voice actor mostly known for minor roles, whether in films like Dirty Harry or TV shows like the original Twilight Zone and Avatar: The Last Airbender. He also does the voice of Garmbel Iblis, both in the Empire at War RTS and The Force Unleashed. HK is the only character apart from T3 who doesn't have a companion quest. However, he more than makes up for this deficiency by possessing something that T3 fundamentally lacked: personality. And by God, what a personality he has.
Objection. Worn out? Listen, you talentless organic meatbag. One word from my master and I will pull you apart, limb from useless limb. I have always been hostile. Now that I need no longer rely on you and your primitive maintenance skills, I do not need to hide it. Observation. I am not a problem, you useless organic meatbag. You and your lack of any organized mechanical skills are a problem. Query. Can I kill him now, Master? I would like ever so much to crush his neck. Just a little. It is a long-time fantasy of mine.
To avoid bloating this video with pretty much every single HK-47 line, because they are all gold, I'm just going to provide a link to a compilation in the description. Suffice to say, I think Tabori has the best voice performance of all the principal characters in the game. HK talks in what sounds like a monotone at first, but if you listen closely enough, you can hear the occasional hints of subtle mockery and barely restrained bloodlust. He's basically Bender from Futurama if he was actually competent. In fact, more than competent. He takes a great deal of professional pride in his efficiency as an assassin. Alas, large chunks of his memory are missing, including how to do some of his primary functions. It doesn't really affect the story, but if the player has put enough points into their character's repair ability, you can unlock certain skills and bonuses for HK in combat, as well as memories regarding some of his previous masters. According to Wikipedia, the original inspiration for HK-47 came from designer David Gator. At the time, he'd recently marathoned a Canadian show called The Littlest Hobo. Essentially in the vein of Lassie, it was the story of a dog who every episode would befriend and help those most in need. HK-47 was therefore conceived as the anti-Littlest Hobo, which is reflected in the stories of his various prior masters as they all came to pretty sticky ends, though not always directly because of HK himself. From a Hutt crime lord that was chopped up into stew meat by one of his rivals, a Mandalorian soldier who attempted to use HK to assassinate his own leader, the Mandalore, only for the droid to be captured, reprogrammed, and used to kill him instead, to a senator on Coruscant who used HK to eliminate his political rivals, only to die by his own assassin droid because he ordered him to kill his adulterous wife, only to regret that decision at the last minute. My personal favorite, though, is the story about his most recent master, a mid-level corporate type who accidentally ordered HK to assassinate most of the leading members of his own company. Then, he flew into a rage and tried to destroy the droid, only to electrocute himself by stabbing HK-47 in his actuator. In case all the gushing wasn't already a giveaway, I too have succumbed to corruption and joined the HK-47 fan club. I declare him not only to be the best companion character in the game, but also the best droid character in all of Star Wars, bar none. Sorry, I-5, you come close, but close doesn't get the brass ring. It's no wonder they brought this character back for both the sequel and the Old Republic MMO. But while we're on the subject of companion characters, there are at least 3 companion character quests that take place on Tatooine, so it's time to talk about them and the people that are concerned with them. Canderous Ordo, Mission Veo, and Bastila Shan. After HK, I would say Canderous is tied with Jolee for the second best companion character in the game. And I say that in both cases it's because of the performances given by their respective voice actors. John Seigan's performance pretty much oozes grizzled veteran. And indeed, all of the conversations between Canderous and the protagonist leading up to the activation of the companion quest is Canderous relaying his old war stories. From hunting down pirates and smugglers after the Sith War, to his very first action piloting a Basilisk war droid. His reminiscences are not only interesting in themselves, they also provide some of the earliest insights into the Mandalorian culture and ethos. Especially the idea that for them, victory is less important than the fight itself. Win or lose, if you fight well, you gain glory. Remember that this is before the Mandalorians became very big as a faction in Star Wars. In fact, KOTOR and its sequel are the ones that helped popularize them among the fans. The Mandalorians had originally been one of many concepts intended for The Empire Strikes Back, but were ultimately left on the cutting room floor. Their first serious appearance as a faction in any Star Wars story was in Tom Veitch and Kevin Anderson's Tales of the Jedi comic, and that was back in 1995. It wouldn't be until 2004 that the Mandalorians began to develop into a serious faction within Star Wars, and this is mostly thanks to author Karen Traviss, who would go on to develop most aspects of Mandalorian culture, including the language. Unsurprisingly, as a veteran of the Mandalorian Wars, Canderous has quite a bit to say about Darth Revan, the heroic Jedi turned Sith Lord. Despite being very much on the losing side of that war, Canderous, if anything, admires Revan. Mostly because he didn't fight like either the Republic or the Jedi usually did. He fought with audacity and cunning. He could plan grand strategy, but also fight inspirationally in the front lines. Whatever anyone else might say of the Mandalorian Wars, Canderous is in no doubt that if it weren't for Revan, the Mandalorians would have won, even though they were outnumbered 5-1 by the Republic. Canderous's companion quest finally unlocks after the protagonist has gotten him to talk about the Battle of Althir, the very first battle of the Mandalorian Wars. During the battle, Canderous noticed an opening in the Althiri defenses and took the opportunity to attack, despite the fact that it went against the previously established battle plan. It ultimately worked, as his sudden attack forced the Althiri to split their forces, leaving themselves open to the Mandalorian assault, but it did cost the lives of many men, including those under his own command. Ultimately, it was a stunning victory, and Canderous stands by his decision years later, regardless of the cost. Indeed, he believes that more lives were saved than wasted. After this little conversation, the party encounters someone who has a very different view of the Battle of Altair III, a former Mandalorian subordinate of Candaris's named Jaggy. Sorry, I just couldn't resist. He accuses Candaris of sacrificing his own men, most of whom were Jaggy's comrades, needlessly in the name of his own personal glory. The only way to settle this, as he sees it, is a duel in the Dune Sea. Next is Mission Veo. In most respects, Mission doesn't deviate much from the plucky street urchin archetype. But a good character is still a good character, archetypal or otherwise. And again, this is mostly down to the voice acting, in this case by Catherine Tabor. It is all too easy for younger teammate characters to come off as annoyingly grating and saccharine. Fortunately, Tabor, and by extension Mission, avoid these pitfalls. She's spunky and streetwise, but still possesses a degree of naive innocence. And even if she's a girl who's grown up mostly on the wrong side of the tracks, she always tries to do what she thinks is right. She's also, however, quick to take offense and really doesn't like being condescended to, i.e. being treated like a little kid. She is initially pretty devastated over the loss of Taris, as for all its problems, it was the only home she'd ever known up to that point. But with the irrepressibility of youth, she eventually gets over it and is more than willing to help the protagonist in his efforts against the Sith. And it doesn't take much effort to get her to open up about her own past. Prior to meeting Zalbar, Mission had been effectively raised by her older brother, Griff, a low-level con man in the lower city of Taris. He essentially taught Mission all she knew in order to survive in the lower city, whether by legal means or decidedly illegal ones. They never had much, as Griff was a pretty shitty con man, but it was enough to get by for a while. Then, so Mission tells the story, Griff met a pretty girl named Lena, who essentially seduced him into abandoning her on Taris. They'd both left the planet, with Griff promising to come back for Mission once he'd made it big, but he never did, and Mission blames Lena for this. Mission's own companion quest unlocks by encountering Lena, who gives a very different account of what happened. Leaving behind Mission, according to her, was all Griff's idea. Believing that he'd taught her all she needed to survive on her own, Griff figured that he could now finally shuck his responsibilities as elder brother and make his own way in the universe, despite Lena even offering to pay for Mission's passage herself. Griff had rejected this idea, saying, untruthfully, that Mission would never willingly leave Taris, even to go with her brother. Of course, Griff was no more successful at being a con man off his homeworld than he was on it, and began to blame others, including Lena, for his failures rather than his own shortcomings, which is why Lena ultimately left Griff. The last she saw of him was on Tatooine. At this point, Mission very much has her brother placed on a pedestal and refuses to accept Lena's version of events. All that can be done is track down Griff on Tatooine and discover the truth come what may. On Tatooine, it is learned that Griff was briefly employed by Zerka Arms, but proved a very unsatisfactory employee, often calling in sick when he wasn't and shirking his duties. At last, he was captured in a Sand People raid, and Zerka Arms simply is glad to wash their hands of him. If he isn't dead by now, he is almost certainly still in their captivity. Then there is the matter of Bastila Shan. Post-Dantooine, over the course of interaction with the Padawan, her somewhat pompous attitude has softened, although her primary concern remains the force bond that exists between the two of them and how it might affect the both of them, as it is very much a two-way street. There is still a bit of that earlier arrogance, though, as she clearly assumes that she will be the positive influence upon the protagonist and fears that he might be a negative influence on her. However, eventually, Bastila opens up and begins to tell about her past. At this point in Star Wars history, the Jedi Order has now fully transitioned into the form that it would mostly retain up until the Clone Wars era, particularly in the ideological sense. Before the Sith War, as established in Tales of the Jedi, the position was that emotions are acceptable and part of what we are, just don't be ruled by them, especially by the negative ones. By the time of the Jedi Civil War, in which KOTOR 1 takes place, we have reached the position of emotions and emotional attachments especially being bad and ought to be avoided lest you fall to the dark side. Naturally, one of the biggest influences this had upon the Jedi Order was how it recruited people. Henceforth, you started Jedi training as a small child, and were separated from your family so that there could be no risk of emotional attachments that could compromise you. This was the case with Bastila. Her father was a treasure hunter, often taking her and her mother to various locales across the galaxy in search of the next big score. Bastila was very fond of her father, but didn't get along so well with her mother, whom she blamed for encouraging her father to go on increasingly dangerous expeditions. When her parents decided to give her to the Jedi Order, Bastila remembers that her father wept to see her go, but that her mother didn't seem nearly as affected by it, suggesting that her own mother was glad to be rid of her. And, although Bastila is initially reluctant to admit it, that still stings a bit, even after all her training in the Jedi ways. It certainly doesn't help that the Jedi ways are pretty strict on such matters, and that Bastila was likely put under more pressure once her unique gift for battle meditation manifested. With great power comes great expectations. This also means that Bastila has to wrestle with self-doubt, constantly worrying, if only in the back of her own head, if she is truly worthy of being a Jedi if she still has these unresolved emotional issues. And while we're on the subject of the Jedi, let's briefly stop everything else to talk about Bastila and her conception. Because originally, Bastila wasn't supposed to be Bastila. Juhani was supposed to be named Bastila. The character that we know as Bastila was originally supposed to be Vima Sunrider, the daughter of Jedi Master Nomi Sunrider, thus tying Knights of the Old Republic 1 directly into the Tales of the Jedi comic by Tom Veitch and Kevin Anderson. Indeed, only a few decades within the internal timeline separate the comic storyline from the game storyline, and you can clearly see artifacts of this original concept sprinkled throughout the game, as multiple characters, mostly Jedi characters, drop deliberate references to the Sith War and even mention Nomi Sunrider and Exar Kun by name. So what happened? In a few words, a copyright battle over the name Sunrider. The opposition, the Best Stop Company, a company that literally made sunroof editions for Jeeps. One such product of theirs was called the Sunrider, and apparently they objected to video game companies like BioWare and Obsidian using the same name for a principal character in their own product. Details are shockingly sparse, to the point of being all but impossible to find. But the long and short of it is that Best Stop ultimately won the legal battle, or at least got to the point where BioWare and Obsidian could not use the name Sunrider for one of their characters in their respective games. And so, Bastila Shan was created to fill in the Vima Sunrider-shaped hole that would otherwise have been left in Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. Anyway, an acquaintance of Bastila's mother encounters the party, recognizes her, and informs the Jedi that her mother is gravely ill and wishes to speak with her. Obviously, Bastila is none too thrilled with the idea, although it would be nice to see her father again. But is such a thing really worth taking time out from the mission to find the Star Forge? In the end, meeting Helena Shan reveals that her husband was killed searching for Krayt Dragon pearls, in the hopes that it would make him enough money to get treatment for his wife. Of course, Bastila blames her mother for her father's death, pushing him into one reckless treasure hunt too many, while Helena counters, insisting that it was all her father's idea, and if anything, she'd often tried to tell him to ease off on the reckless treasure hunting. Anyway, now that she's essentially dying, Helena asks that her daughter retrieve her father's holocron, so at least she will have something of her husband with her when she dies. With the hunting license and a translator droid, sort of, in tow, our heroes leave Anchorhead behind and head out for the Dune Sea. First things first, there's the business between Canderous and Jaggy. Fail to persuade him that Canderous made the right call at Althir, and a fight ensues. Succeed, and Jaggy kills himself out of shame. Either way, Jaggy ends up dead, and Canderous is more than a little disturbed by the experience. So once again, the branching narrative pulls a bit of a Habsburg. You know, now that I think of it, that should be a term in gaming for narratives that do this sort of thing. Let's make Habsburging a gaming term, people. That said, this particular moral dilemma is genuinely fascinating. While Jaggy killing himself is the canon version, I'm not really sure which is the right answer here. Canderous can, with perfect logic, argue that his actions saved more lives than it killed, but that kind of needs of the many outweighs the needs of the few kind of thinking is a little harder to justify even to yourself when confronted by one of the few. As Jaggy points out, Canderous was responsible for those directly under his command. That being the case, isn't he also obligated to make sure that they survive as well as win if at all possible? It is a bit of a commentary on the kind of snap decisions that commanders make in the heat of battle, whether to make one sacrifice or another in the name of victory. The party makes its way into Sand People territory and naturally are ambushed by the locals. However, in death, the hapless attackers provide a means of possibly getting close enough to the Sand People leader to speak with them without being killed on sight. After all, our heroes did much the same with the Sith uniforms back on Taris. It is kind of darkly hilarious, though, that wearing the dead Sand People's clothing allows the hero and his friends to get close enough for HK to say, "We come in peace," even as they're still wearing the belongings of their victims. The Tusken chieftain is suspicious and hostile, but is ultimately willing to cease the attacks on the Zerka miners for a price. He is willing to relocate his tribe to somewhere else in the Dune Sea, but only if the Padawan can provide him with moisture evaporators so that his tribe can have a steady supply of water. The chieftain is actually surprised when the Padawan and his friends fulfill their end of the bargain, so he not only reveals the location of the star map to the heroes, he also provides his gaffy stick as a token of respect and allows the release of his prisoners, including Griff Veo. Unfortunately, it seems that Lena may have had the right of it, as Mission's brother turns out to be a shifty little weasel of a man. One of the first things he does upon recognizing his sister is ask if she's got any credits to spare. Back in Anchorhead, he manages to wheedle the protagonist into giving him some startup money and some tack glands to make Tarisian ale, which apparently is going to be in very short supply and supposedly therefore more valuable now that Taris is a smoking crater. Yet another get-rich-quick scheme. This despite the fact that, thanks to Mission and the Padawan, he's even been able to land an honest job in Anchorhead. Mission is more than a little disappointed, to say the least, that the brother she had kind of put on a pedestal for most of her life turned out to be, well, this, but there's little time to reflect. The star map is still to be found. Just like in the vision, the star map is indeed in a cave. Unfortunately, that cave is inhabited by a massive cave crate dragon. On the advice of Twi'lek hunter Comad Fortuna, supposedly a distant relative of Bib, and is gunning for the dragon for his own reasons, explosives are buried near the mouth of the crate dragon's cave, and then some banthas are brought forward to lure it out into the open so that it walks on top of the explosives, thus killing it. Our heroes get access to the star map, recover Bastila's father's holocron, and even obtain the crate dragon's pearl. Fun fact, if you give the pearl to the Sand People, they tell a pretty interesting story with regards to the mysterious Builders. Like so many races, the ancestors of the Sand People were enslaved by the Builders, but after a mysterious plague that weakened them, rose up in revolt. In retaliation, the Builders bombarded the planet, turning Tatooine, once lush and green, into the desert that it is now. The Sand People's ancestors only survived by hiding in caves. From that point on, according to HK, who is translating the story, they have managed to survive ever since. He delivers it with his usual sarcasm and contempt for the meatbags. I will never not snicker at his fighting over who has the biggest bantha quip. Returning to Anchorhead, there is both good news and bad news. The bad news is that Griff's get-rich-quick scheme with the Tarisian ale fell through, and he is once again on the run from angry creditors of the intergalactic syndicate kind. Mission is at this point thoroughly disillusioned, but after talking things out with the Padawan, eventually comes to the conclusion that just because Griff turned out to be very different than how she remembered him, it isn't the end of the universe. She can still be grateful to Griff for teaching her how to survive back on Taris, but at this point she no longer has to owe him anything. She helped get him a second chance after freeing him from the Sand People. If he refuses to take it, that's his problem. It's actually a nice little coming-of-age moment. Disillusionment is the lot of the young, especially as they grow up and begin to realize that the world is neither as simple or as accommodating as they would like it to be. Some just get wrapped up and obsessed with the unfairness of it all, while others realize that the only thing to do is to accept the world for what it is, warts and all, and make the best of what you can. In fact, coming to terms with that and learning to make the best of it is half the business of being an adult. On a more positive note, after returning her father's holocron to her mother, Bastila is actually able to achieve, with a little help from the Padawan, a bit of a reconciliation, even providing her mother with some money to go to Coruscant and find treatment for her illness. It's not a perfect reconciliation. It's clear that there are still some rifts that will take time to heal, but that's far more realistic than a simple, oh, all is forgiven and forgotten. And just like that, a weight that Bastila didn't even realize she'd been carrying most of her life is lifted from her shoulders. She is genuinely grateful to the Padawan for insisting that she recover her father's holocron for her mother, and even starts to see him in a new, more positive light, though she still gets annoyed by his teasing flirtations, but hey, that's all part of the fun. From this point forward, Bastila's interaction with the Padawan is mostly about the dangers of falling to the dark side, which the Jedi Code warns against, but also some of the restrictions and limitations and the very, very high expectations of same. For all that KOTOR 2 is often held up as the great subversive fist in the face to the tropes and assumptions of the Star Wars universe in general and the Jedi Code in particular, I don't think KOTOR 1 is given nearly enough credit for its own explorations of the limitations of the Jedi morality, simply because it isn't the primary thematic focus of the story the way it is in the sequel. The Jedi Code is essentially one of emotional and intellectual self-abnegation. Prequel haters can boo and hiss about how the Jedi Order is portrayed in the prequel films, but this is the logical conclusion of what Lucas had originally intended. You look at material like his early notes, and especially at The Star Wars, a comic adaptation of his original unedited draft of the first film, the Jedi were always intended to be Buddhist warrior monks in space, detached from seemingly petty earthly matters like emotional attachments. However, as Knights of the Old Republic points out through characters like Bastila, this kind of enlightenment is very hard to achieve and is especially hard to demand of people in general. Things like emotional attachments, as well as our own desires and how we feel about things, are part of what makes our identity as people. Asking adults who presumably have enough maturity to understand the value of Jedi enlightenment to reject these things is hard enough of a sell. Imagine how much harder it is to demand that of a small child like Bastila was when she was separated from her parents and inducted into the Order. It's no wonder that by the Clone Wars era, the Jedi Order would only take in students when they were infants. Such students would lack even the memory of other people to be emotionally attached to. In that light, the fate of the Jedi Order by the end of the prequel films is a demonstration of how this move in the direction of greater and greater emotional detachment was ultimately a mistake. They were not only so detached from the world, they were also so certain that this was right that they completely failed to see the evil working to bring about their downfall and neglect the emotional development of the human time bomb in their own midst. In a sense, Bastila does have certain parallels to Anakin Skywalker. No doubt if one of the Jedi Council had been along on this mission, they would have advised against interacting with her mother, insisting that the lingering emotions between mother and daughter could only be a potential threat and a slippery slope toward the dark side. There's a fundamental difference between making peace with and letting go of one's inner demons and simply burying such demons away, leaving them unresolved. This is why Bastila feels so much better about herself after reconciling with her mother, but it also makes her afraid. Being raised nearly all of her life in the Jedi way, the Code has been the foundation of her life and sense of self. And yet here is the hero often doing the right thing, though not always in ways that align with the Code. What does it mean for her if at least some aspects of the Code are wrong, or even at least not entirely right? Mightn't these very doubts be the beginning of the slippery slope to the dark side? She only needs to look at recent history to see the consequences of such a thing. Revan and Malak were once great heroes. Now they are the worst threat to the galaxy since Exar Kun. And even with their combined power in the dark side, they wouldn't have gotten nearly as far as they have been without the Star Forge or their ability to seduce so many Jedi away from the teachings of the light into the embrace of the dark side.
What greater weapon is there than to turn an enemy to your cause, to use their own knowledge against them?
But that will have to be resolved later. For now, we move on to our next planet, Manaan. Manaan is an ocean planet inhabited by an amphibious race known as the Selkath. Obviously, the Selkath themselves have no trouble with a world that's all ocean. Most off-world species aren't, though. In recognition of this, the Selkath constructed Ahto City for the convenience of off-world visitors. As one might expect from an aquatic race, Ahto City is all soft-toned colors and smooth lines, with regular background shots of the world-spanning ocean that I think are possibly the best background in the whole game. Once again, I must give a shout out to Jeremy Sewell, as the Ahto City theme is possibly my favorite ambient music in all of Knights of the Old Republic. It's just so quiet, peaceful, and soothing. In many ways, a welcome break from some of the more hectic environments our heroes have been in. Though as we'll soon discover, the soothing tone belies the inner tensions lurking under the surface. Then there's the Selkath themselves. Alongside one other race that we won't encounter until much later in the game, the Selkath are a BioWare original creation. And I really love their design. Their heads are this fun combination of manta ray and whale shark. And they are, for the most part, a peaceable, law-abiding people. In fact, quite legalistic, as we'll soon see. Their speech, on the other hand, and like all the alien speech in this game, it lasts far longer than it takes to read the translation. You better believe that I was skipping through this as much as I could. There's only so much emphysemic bullfrog my ears are prepared to tolerate. The political situation on Manaan is especially unique in this game. Taris was under Sith occupation. Dantooine is firmly aligned with the Jedi and the Republic. The Wookiees are far too insular and suspicious of outsiders to really care about this conflict one way or another, and Tatooine is simply too provincial to matter to anyone. Manaan, however, is riddled with political tension because it is a world of vital importance to both sides of the war. It is the sole producer of a substance known as Kolto, a kind of miracle medical substance that essentially is the precursor to Bacta. Fully aware of the advantage that this kind of monopoly has granted them, the Selkath have set up Manaan as a completely neutral world in the conflict between the Old Republic and the Sith Empire. They believe that the best way to ensure Manaan's safety and security is to deal equally with both sides, with the implicit understanding that if one side or the other tries to screw with their neutrality, the Selkath will simply stop doing business with them and sell all their Kolto to the enemy. Anyone who's been in military logistics can tell you of just how important it is to make sure that the soldiers are well supplied with medicine. As such, both the Republic and the Sith Empire are heavily represented in Ahto City. However, peace here is fragile and only maintained through great effort, both on the part of the Sith and Republic local leaders who don't want to lose access to the Kolto, and by the vigilance of Selkath security officers and the impartiality of their legal courts in dealing with the inevitable disputes between the two sides. This is the quagmire that our heroes must navigate in their quest for the next star map. And there is perhaps no better example of the political tensions in Ahto City, not to mention the moral ambiguities of the situation, than the companion quest for Jolee Bindo. On further reflection, I think that Jolee does in fact beat out Canderous for the post of second best companion character in KOTOR. While he doesn't have as many funny and entertaining lines as HK, he does wield snark with the best of them, with a thorough sprinkling of genuine words of wisdom. Initially, Bastila served as a kind of mentor to the Padawan, but by the third planet in their quest, it's pretty clear to everyone, including Bastila herself, that the hero's powers have begun to surpass her own. However, Jolee is able to fill in that mentor role because he has something that no amount of skill or power can replace: experience and the wisdom that comes with it. In one conversation, you might be snickering at how he says Sith make good sandwiches, or his telling the story of a young Jedi who was supposed to have a great destiny, and he would indeed save an entire sector from an evil warlord, by being thrown into an engine intake by said warlord and then somehow fouling up the system so bad that it caused the warlord's ship to explode, killing him. Other times he'll be giving genuine sage advice, most of it couched in crotchety old man talk, also usually having something to do with criticizing the Jedi Order. All three Jedi companion characters provide some angle of critique on the Jedi Order and its failings. I've already talked about Bastila, but Zhou Li is by far the most brazen and blunt in his criticisms. He completely rejects the Jedi assertion that love is a surefire path to the dark side. If anything, he views it as a kind of potential salvation, but he also thinks that while the Jedi as a general rule mean well and genuinely try to do good, they are too self-righteous and set in their ways to recognize the flaws and weaknesses in their own ideology, let alone make the necessary course correction. Even if what someone does is the right thing, unless it conforms to the Jedi Code, the Council will denounce it as unbecoming of a true Jedi. Zhou Li, who himself never made it past the rank of Padawan before he quit the Order, although he likes to insist that the Order left him, spent the most of his youth on many wild hair-raising adventures across the galaxy, often meeting and making new friends along the way. At some point in the game, one of these friends informs Zhou Li that another acquaintance of his, Sunri, is being tried for murder on Manaan. This is confirmed on Manaan by an encounter with Sunri's distraught wife, Elora, who begs Zhou Li to find some way of proving that Sunri is innocent of the crime. The crime of murdering a Sith in training named Elassa Huros. Describing the investigation in detail would leave this video even more bloated than it already is, so I'm going to be very succinct here. The Selkath court appoints the protagonist as Sunri's arbiter, essentially a combination investigator and defense attorney. The court also provides sufficient information to begin the investigation, which mostly involves investigating the hotel room where Elassa was killed and interrogating those who are known to be witnesses to the act, mostly people in the neighboring rooms who overheard what happened. It is revealed that Sunri, a decorated veteran of the Sith War, albeit crippled by his injuries, was carrying on an affair with Elassa. When confronted about it, his wife, Elora, admits that she knew of it, but swears that on the night of the murder, Sunri was going to meet Elassa simply to break it off. He had no intention of murdering her. It's also uncovered that Elassa was a Sith spy, using her affair with Sunri to try and get information out of him, though she was never very successful at it. And because Sunri was a decorated veteran of the Sith War, the Sith try to finger him regardless of whether or not he actually did kill Elassa, namely by paying one of the other hotel residents to plant Sunri's service medal on the corpse. Unfortunately for Zhou Li, slicing through some encrypted files in the Republic Embassy confirms that in fact, Sunri is responsible for the murder of Elassa, shooting her in the back when she was unarmed and unsuspecting. Sunri can be confronted with this before the trial, but honestly the build-up to the trial, and indeed the trial itself, is less important to me, and certainly less interesting, than the possible outcomes. No Habsburging in the Sunri trial questline, no sir. And in fact, despite the normally light side dark side binary of the game, this is one of the rare instances where KOTOR dives firmly into the gray. You can omit the crucial information from the Republic Embassy and persuade the court to free Sunri on the basis that there is no substantial evidence. Do not present this crucial evidence, but fail to defend him properly, and Sunri gets a prison sentence. Present the damning evidence up front, and Sunri will be found guilty and executed. Perhaps the wildest outcome, at least in my opinion, is that you can present the damning recording, get Sunri to confess his guilt in court, but then successfully prove that Sunri was being fingered as part of a Sith conspiracy, and this will cause the Selkath to be antagonized towards the Sith, resulting in Sunri getting an innocent verdict, literally getting away with murder. There is no canon verdict here, as this doesn't have a bearing on the main plot. But it is genuinely fascinating here, as while you can make the argument that some of the results fall more towards the light side than others, it is far more ambiguous morally than any of the other moral choices the player has had to make throughout the game up to this point. It's genuinely brilliant in my opinion. Anyway, regardless of the verdict, Zhou Li is disturbed by the revelation that this old friend of his did indeed commit cold-blooded murder. And afterwards, this finally causes him to open up to the Padawan about aspects of his past that he's been very cagey about, namely his wife, Naiyama. The two met some years prior to the Sith War, when she shot his shuttle out of the sky. They eventually got married, despite some disapproval from the Jedi Council, and because she was strong in the Force, Jolee took it upon himself to train her, again despite the disapproval of the Council. Alas, tragedy finally came a knockin' during the Sith War, when Naiyama became one of many young Jedi seduced to the dark side by Exar Kun. In her case, it was partly out of resentment for the Jedi's refusal to allow her and Jolee to live the life they wanted to live. Despite her attempts to persuade him to join her, Jolee refused, seeing Exar Kun for what he was. And then, Naiyama attacked her own husband and tried to kill him. In the end, Jolee won the fight, but couldn't bring himself to kill the woman he loved. After she fled, he blamed himself for failing her, that both his training and his love had failed to keep her from falling to evil. Further compounding his guilt was the fact that Naiyama went on to kill many Jedi until she herself was finally killed near the end of the Sith War. Had Jolee killed her then and there, many innocent lives might have been spared. It was then that the Jedi Council did something that finally broke Jolee's confidence and faith in the Order and its dogmas. Not because they punished him for his mistakes, but because they forgave him. And indeed, because they thought that he'd attained wisdom the hard way, they were finally going to promote him to the rank of Jedi Knight. But even if the Council could forgive him, Jolee could not forgive himself. The fact that the Council not only refused to punish him for his mistakes, but reward him for it, convinced him that the Order was not fit to determine what was just or unjust, and as such, did not deserve his loyalty. So he left, wandering the galaxy for a few years before finally settling into a self-imposed exile in the Shadowlands of Kashyyyk. And yet, in a way, he still does believe what he said earlier about the power of love as a force for good. Jolee's backstory is possibly one of the saddest I've ever encountered in a video game. Admittedly, I haven't played many video games, but still. But now, on to the main plot. According to another shared Force vision between the Padawan and Bastila, the star map on Manaan is somewhere at the bottom of the sea. Upon arrival in Manaan, our heroes are directed to the Republic ambassador to Manaan, Roland Wan, and he is indeed willing to help for a price. He wants our heroes to recover a probe droid that was recently captured by the Sith, preferably before the Sith can decrypt its programming and uncover something that the Republic would rather not become public knowledge. The game, through Ambassador Wan, offers 3 ways of possibly getting inside the Sith embassy where the droid is being held. Interrogate a captured Sith spy in order to gain the information to access the facility, decrypt some intercepted Sith data cards in order to gain entry, or, most direct and dangerous of all, use a keycard from the captured Sith spy to gain access to a heavily guarded docking bay containing transports that will take its riders directly to the Sith base. Either way, once inside, it's another round of cutting the Sith down like chumps, and recovering the data from the damaged probe droid. In the midst of all this, the heroes encounter a group of young Selkath, who the Sith are indoctrinating into the ways of the dark side. Sith have never been the kindest or most gentle of instructors, and the heroes also discover several young Selkath corpses, victims of the brutality and callousness of their instructors. This evidence eventually persuades the young Selkath who are still alive to abandon the cause of the Sith and flee the facility. This proves especially fortuitous, as shortly after departing the facility with the recovered data, Otto City Security arrests our heroes for breaking and entering and several counts of first and second degree murder and haul them off to court. Luckily, the revelation that the Sith are indeed trying to indoctrinate their youth is enough to persuade the judges to let our heroes off, and so they avoid jail time or worse. With the information from the droid back safely in Republic hands, Ambassador Wan elaborates on the situation. Although most Selkath cling to the idea of neutrality, there are a small but notable minority who agree with the Republic that the Sith are evil and cannot be trusted. This is relevant because it turns out the Republic and these sympathetic Selkath have constructed a secret illegal culto harvesting facility completely in defiance of Manaan's neutral policy and under the noses of its leadership, with the intent that this might give the Republic a bit of an edge in the war by having more culto for itself. However, recently, communications with the facility have gone silent. Initially, the Republic hired various mercenaries to go down and investigate the matter, but nothing's been heard from them either. The probe droid was sent down next, but it was heavily damaged by something down there, which is how it fell into the hands of the Sith. Ambassador Wan provides our heroes with a submersible to take them down to the Rakata Rift, where the illicit culto harvesting facility is located. Perhaps they will have better luck finding out what happened down there. What happened down there is pretty disturbing. Upon arrival at the facility, the Padawan and his team meet a surviving merc, who reveals that something has driven the Selkath mad, causing them to kill and even cannibalize their Republic colleagues. After cutting down horde after horde of crazed aliens, and slowly, painfully walking across the ocean floor in an enviro suit armed with only a sonic emitter in Firaxan shark-infested waters, the Padawan discovers the two remaining surviving Republic scientists, one Kono Nolan and his assistant Sami. They reveal that after they'd fully set up the facility and begun harvesting culto in earnest, all the industrial activity attracted the attention of a giant Firaxan shark. As it began to destroy the equipment harvesting the culto, the giant shark let out some kind of strange signal that sent the other Firaxan sharks and the Selkath into their current killing frenzy. At this point, there are only two ways to possibly salvage the situation. Nolan insists that the Padawan use a special poison he's recently developed to kill the giant shark. Sami, however, believes that this toxin could very well taint the culto and do irreparable damage to the ocean ecosystem. Her alternative is that the Padawan destroy the harvesting equipment by overpressurizing the system. With the target of its ire destroyed, hopefully the shark will stand down. The Padawan opts to adopt Sami's plan, and it actually works out just as intended. The giant Firaxan stops attacking and simply watches serenely as the hero, very slowly, walks over to the star map. Only one left to go. Before our heroes can depart for the surface, one last problem stands in their way. Malak's would-be right-hand man, Darth Bandon, the man responsible for leading the attack on the Endar Spire and killing Ensign Trask. Of course, our heroes eventually triumph over Bandon and his lackeys, and that's really all there is to say about him because Bandon is almost aggressively boring. Malak and Karath are the main villains and thus have gotten a bit more attention, but even Calo Nord, as brief as his appearance was, at least had something in the way of personality. Everything about Bandon, even his name, is dull and forgettable. He may as well be named Darth Placeholder. Back on the surface, our heroes are once again dragged into court by the angry Otto City authorities and are demanded to explain their shenanigans at the no longer secret culto harvesting facility. The Padawan is forced to fess up to everything, but revealing that he spared the life of the giant shark actually holds sway with the judges, who seem to suggest that the giant Firaxan may have been the progenitor, the semi-mystical, semi-sacred ancestor of the Selkath race, which would at least partially explain how the Firaxan was able to influence the behavior of the Selkath within the facility. In the end, the Padawan and his friends walk away home free. Apparently, if the player decides to go with Nolan's suggestion and poison the giant shark, the poison does indeed taint the culto as Sami had feared, and the Selkath judges, outraged by the killing of their ancient progenitor, essentially tell you to get out and never come back. Another bit of narrative Habsburging, admittedly, but at least it does make some kind of sense. After all, if the Selkath authorities chose to execute or imprison you for possibly committing sacrilege in this way, it would end the narrative prematurely, and we can't have that. Before our heroes depart for the fourth and final planet where a star map might be found, some developments. First, concerning Carth. At long last, the Padawan learns why Carth has such burning hatred for Saul Karath, the Sith Empire's new admiral. It wasn't simply that he betrayed the Republic, it was something far more personal. Before the Jedi Civil War, Carth wasn't just a soldier, he was an aspiring family man with a wife and a young son named Dustil. Then, after Kareth defected to the Sith, Malak decided to test the Admiral's loyalty by ordering him to bombard Telos 4. By the time the Republic arrived, it was already too late, and Karth reached his wife only for her to die in his arms moments later. Dustil was never seen again, and is presumed to be dead. However, an encounter with an old friend of Karth's reveals that Dustil is still alive, but he has decided to join the Sith and is currently being trained on Korriban, so even more reason to go. Then there's Juhani. The relationship between Juhani and the Padawan starts off somewhat rocky. Although she is grateful to the hero for bringing her back from the dark side, a part of her still clings to her anger. Partly at herself in self-recrimination for failing her master's test, though personally I think Quattra's idea of a test of one's character is like throwing a kid into the deep end without showing them how to swim, but also in part at the protagonist, because it turns out before she became a Jedi, Taris was her home, or at least the only home she ever knew. Logically, she knows that it isn't fair to blame the Padawan for Malak ordering the destruction of Taris, just so that he could be sure of eliminating Bastila. But unfortunately, logic and emotion have never been on speaking terms, and it takes her a while to finally get over that particular hump. At which point, she finally begins to open up about herself and her past. Her parents had fled to Taris from the Cathar homeworld when they were nearly genocided by the Mandalorians. Unfortunately, they ended up picking a pretty crummy place to live, given the elitism of the upper city residents of Taris and the strong anti-alien bias that was in evidence there even before the Sith occupation. Her family made a pretty miserable living, scraping by in the slums of the lower city. Eventually, her father got addicted to stims and died in a drunken bar fight, while her mother wasted away soon after, leaving behind little but a pile of debts to the Exchange, the infamous criminal syndicate. In typical scumbag fashion, they decided that Juhani should inherit her mother's debts, and since she couldn't pay them, they decided to sell her into slavery. And then the Jedi came. Presumably the Revankists, as they were on their way to fight the Mandalorians. Guardians of truth and justice that they usually try to be, the Jedi took exception to the slavers, kicked their asses, and freed their would-be property, including Juhani. It was the shining example of these Jedi, and especially their inspirational leader, that gave Juhani a goal to strive for. Once she was able to scrape together enough money, she booked passage on the first ship to Dantooine to enter Jedi training. The big shocker is that the leader of these Jedi, the one that inspired her to become one herself, was Revan. Of course, he wasn't Darth Revan just yet, but still. Even his fall to the dark side did not dampen Juhani's dream. When she went to Dantooine, she resolved to try and be a Jedi like Revan was, not like the Sith he ultimately became. Unfortunately, she had trouble adjusting to Jedi life, especially the part that requires her to control her emotions, which is partly why she lashed out at Quattra in the first place. Even now, a part of that anger still smolders. But stronger than Juhani's anger is her guilt and shame. The Jedi Council may have forgiven her for falling to the dark side, but much like the situation with Jolee and his wife, Juhani has a hard time forgiving herself. Having strayed from the light before, is she still truly worthy of the Jedi ways? And finally, there's Bastila. Despite her best efforts, Bastila is forced to admit to the Padawan that she can no longer deny the fact that she does have feelings for him. Force bond or no force bond. Our hero, with his more laissez-faire attitude towards Jedi and attachments, is all too happy to reciprocate, as he loves Bastila just as much. But though they finally share a kiss, and possibly more, the cutscene is ambiguous but suggestive, Bastila comes away from the encounter convinced that this was a mistake and that it puts both her and the hero at great risk. But there's little time to dwell on such romantic entanglements. As the Ebon Hawk makes way for Korriban, it is suddenly yanked out of hyperspace by the Leviathan, the massive Interdictor-class cruiser that is the flagship of Malak's Sith Empire. With no way of outrunning or outfighting the massive ship, our heroes resort to a desperate plan. It's assumed that Karth, the Padawan, and Bastila will be taken prisoner personally by Saul Karath. The others will just be thrown into whatever detention block the Leviathan has. The player now has to choose one of the other members of the crew to either fake an injury, or in the case of the droids, be deactivated, so that the Sith will underestimate that chosen person, giving he or she the best chance to escape, free everyone else, and then reclaim the Ebon Hawk. The only person that you can't pick for this, apart from Bastila and Karth, is Zalbar, as a Wookiee is just a little too conspicuous for that sort of thing. Luckily for all involved, this is a plan that actually does survive first contact with the enemy. Malak is currently not aboard the Leviathan, and so Karath has to send a message to his master to inform him that he's finally caught his prey at long last. But not before subjecting Bastila, Karth, and the Padawan to a great deal of torture, as well as revealing that the Academy on Dantooine has just been leveled by the Sith. While the Admiral goes off to relay his message, the chosen crew member, despite being stripped of weapons and armor, manages to sneak past and/or subdue enough bad guys to liberate the crew. While everyone else heads back to the Ebon Hawk, Karth, Bastila, and the Padawan decide to take the bridge and Admiral Karath. Having recovered their weapons and equipment, our trio of badasses makes short work of the bridge crew and the evil Admiral. However, that triumph is quickly soured, for as he dies, Karath reveals something to Karth that has the Republic soldier more on edge than ever. But there's no time to address it now. They hurry back towards the ship, only to be intercepted by the recently returned Darth Malak. And at long last, we come to it. The big twist. The thing that made KOTOR famous both as a story and as a video game.
What? You mean you don't know? All this time and you still haven't figured it out. I wonder how long you would have stayed blind to the truth. Surely some of what you once were must have surfaced by now. Even the combined power of the Jedi Council couldn't keep your true identity buried forever, could it?
The Jedi do not believe in killing their prisoners. No one deserves execution, no matter what their crimes.
The Council would not normally accept an adult for training, but this is a special case.
They say the Force can do terrible things to a mind. It can wipe away your memories and destroy your very identity.
Tatooine. Kashyyyk. Manaan. Korriban. Revan visited each of these worlds searching for clues to reveal the hidden location of the Starforge.
The lure of the dark side is difficult to resist. I fear this quest to find the Starforge could lead you down an all too familiar path.
What greater weapon is there than to turn an enemy to your cause, to use their own knowledge against them?
Yes, the Padawan, the protagonist, the hero of the story, you the player, are in fact Darth Revan, former Dark Lord of the Sith. Gravely injured when his treacherous apprentice fired upon his own ship, and then captured and brainwashed by the Jedi into a Republic soldier, in the hopes that his subconscious memories would lead them to the Starforge. Pop culture osmosis and the internet being what they are, this was a twist that I already knew about going in, even though I'd never played this game before. Even so, this was a brilliant executed twist. So many subtle hints in throwaway lines of dialogue, all the perfectly buried clues, the brilliant way that this justifies how you, as a video game protagonist, so quickly turn out to be a badass? Because you already were one, you just don't remember. Even though the light side version of the story is canon, it also provides a great justification for why you might choose the dark side option. As flawed as the old Jedi Order was depicted, particularly in the prequels, this is possibly the very first time that we actually see the Jedi do something morally objectionable. Regardless of who Revan was, what right did they have to take someone, destroy their identity, and then remake them into a tool of their design? Even as they preach about the righteousness of their own cause to your face. As stated previously, the only part that I think cuts it a little too close and almost threatens to give everything away is the computer on Kashyyyk. But that doesn't matter if you choose that to be the 4th planet in your search for the star maps. Now, a twist doesn't always need build-up. After all, I Am Your Father came completely out of left field, and it's regarded as one of the greatest twists in the history of film. What makes a twist great is how it recontextualizes everything that you have experienced up to this point. It makes you rethink all of the assumptions, all the things you thought you knew until that sudden moment of revelation. And Knights of the Old Republic, even decades afterward, pulls this off with an aplomb that arguably BioWare never quite surpassed, with the possible exception of the revelation of Sovereign in Mass Effect 1. Alas, right on the heels of this great narrative triumph, BioWare kinda stumbles a little. Regardless of whether or not Revan chooses to forgive Bastila for her deception, Malak paralyzes her and Karth with the Force, and Revan must face his old apprentice alone. And so, he faces off against Malak, the final antagonist, the big boss of the game, and he wins. Yes, Malak does technically paralyze Revan suddenly with Force stasis, but for all intents and purposes, this was a boss fight, and you've won. Narratively, it would make so much more sense for Malak to win, for him to essentially be invincible and unkillable. Even if Revan is technically stronger than his old apprentice, it would make perfect sense for him to lose here. Thanks to the shocking revelation of his true identity, he would be mentally off his game, in the same way that Luke was when he fought Vader in Empire Strikes Back. It would also be a great way of furthering the story through gameplay. RPGs are at least in part power fantasies. Part of the appeal is that as you progress, you become more and more of an awesome badass. How much more intriguing would it be if BioWare had broken the power fantasy in this particular moment? Suddenly introduce an element of helplessness and powerlessness. Malak is not a complicated villain. It's clear that whatever he was in the past, at this point he is meant to serve as the pure evil big bad. He has a distinctive design, and Raphael Ferrer is clearly having fun yucking it up as the evil overlord, but if you want to keep a villain like this simple, you at least have to make them intimidating. The fact that you, the player, are able to beat Malak in what is not the final confrontation, only for him to pull a get-out-of-jail card, undermines this. Anyway, as Malak prepares to cut down his paralyzed former master, Bastila intervenes and manages to distract the Sith Lord long enough for Karth and Revan to make their escape. With Karath and the Leviathan's bridge crew dead, no one is able to stop the Ebon Hawk from making its desperate escape. As the crew try to come to terms with what just happened, including the loss of Bastila, a still angry Karth forces Revan to reveal his true identity to the others. After the initial shock, much to Karth's surprise, the rest of the crew are still willing to trust the former Sith Lord. Jolee is fine with the idea, claiming that he always knew who Revan was. Personally, I call BS on that one. Mission and Zalbar figure that who Revan is now is far more important than who he was. And who he is now is the guy who saved their lives back on Taris. As far as Canderous is concerned, Revan is the greatest badass of their time. That alone makes him worthy of following. As for Juhani, the revelation is shocking, but in many ways it brings her some comfort. Revan was, after all, the man who inspired her to originally become a Jedi. The fact that, like her, he has fallen to the dark side but returned to the light gives her hope that she may be able to resist the dark side's temptation in the future. As for HK, it seems that Revan's revelation has unlocked the remainder of the droid's buried memories. Revan was in fact HK's original master, to whose service the assassin droid is more than happy to return. From the fully restored HK, Revan is able to learn a few things about who he used to be. Namely, that he was a lot more evil back then, and that he himself is in fact the reason why HK refers to organics as meatbags. See, HK had referred to Malak as such when Revan's former apprentice had asked the droid's opinion of him. This had so amused Revan that he had reprogrammed the droid to refer to all organics as meatbag ever since. Karth is reluctant at first. Unlike the others, he has suffered directly at the hands of the Sith Empire that Revan built. But in the end, he recognizes that at this point they have little other choice if they are to save Bastila and stop Malak. And so our heroes make way for Korriban and the last star map. After one of Revan's buried memories reveals that the star map is somewhere inside an ancient Sith tomb, the Ebon Hawk at last comes into land on the ancient homeworld of the Sith. As a general rule, the order in which you look for the star maps doesn't affect the main plot. It just alters certain character interactions and gives you different lines of dialogue. That said, from what I've seen, most people who play KOTOR insist that Korriban is best when it's done last. And after having played through it, I can assure you I'm not going to break ranks on this one. Firstly, the atmosphere in general is once again spot on. Jeremy Sewell's soundtrack for this planet is grim and menacing, as Korriban should be. The fact that while you're there, Korriban seems locked in a perpetual twilight with long menacing shadows amidst the tombs and obelisks certainly doesn't hurt. But there's also the fact that here, now that he knows who he is, Revan is forced to face something that he created. The Sith Academy. A place that he and Malak established for the purpose of creating new generations of evil assholes to serve the dark side and them in their conquest of the galaxy. Right from the beginning, the tone is set that this is essentially a dark mirror image of Dantooine and the Jedi Academy there. Where the Jedi Academy had an atmosphere of relative serenity and peace, Korriban has a palpable atmosphere of menace. And it becomes quite clear the instant Revan and co. leave the dock. Everywhere they go and everywhere they look, they see Sith and would-be Sith throwing their weight around, abusing anyone they can get away with abusing. There's one asshole who basically abuses a trio of other people and then yells at them even more for not challenging him, even though they know he would kill them if they did. Meanwhile, there's another who's tricked a bunch of locals that if they just stand by the gates of the academy long enough, they might be recognized as worthy and let in. In reality, that's not the case, and he's just watching them try not to collapse from starvation and hunger for his own sick amusement. But before we move on to the story proper, there is the matter of Juhani's companion quest. At some point during the search for the star maps, depending on how you advance the relationship with Juhani, the team have an encounter with Zor, who soon reveals that he was in fact the man that provoked Juhani's father into the bar fight that got him killed. As if that weren't enough, Zor worked with the Mandalorians during the Mandalorian Wars and participated personally in the genocide of Cathar. Weird thing about this though, in the Xbox version of KOTOR, Zor is a human. In the PC version, he's a Twi'lek. And yet in both versions, he basically acts like a racist towards non-humans. He literally uses the word non-human. Definitely an oversight on BioWare's part. At any rate, Zor hates the Cathar because they left him with near crippling injuries during the fighting on their homeworld. For that reason, when he ended up on Taris and saw Juhani's father in that bar, he deliberately provoked the fight to give him an excuse to kill the alien. As if he weren't slimy enough, he also reveals that he'd fully intended to buy Juhani when she was originally being sold into slavery by the Exchange, but that the intervention of Revan and his Jedi had ruined the opportunity. All by his lonesome, he's quick to back down in front of Juhani and her friends, but later attempts to ambush the young Cathar Jedi along with some hired thugs shortly after the Ebon Hawk arrives on Korriban. They are all swiftly dispatched, but Zor, a spiteful bastard to the end, still tries to wrest some satisfaction out of his impending death by trying to goad Juhani into giving into her anger and finishing him off. Revan, however, is able to talk her down from her rage by reminding her of the first mantra of the Jedi Code. There is no emotion, there is peace. And at last, Juhani is able to bury the last of her old demons and let go of her anger. Not only has she found her way back to the light, but she now has the confidence to believe that she will never succumb to the temptation of the dark side again, the thing that has haunted her ever since she struck down Master Quatra. And of course, if you happen to be playing female Revan, this unlocks that hidden, secret lesbian romance storyline that BioWare so cheekily snuck in. Smooth bastards. Also, if the player chose to kill Juhani back in the Darkside Grove on Dantooine, one of the other students at the Academy, Belia, with whom Juhani was, very close, ends up defecting to the Sith, and you are forced to fight her outside the Academy on Korriban shortly after you arrive. At any rate, it's quickly clear that the only way to progress is to obtain entry to the Sith Academy, and the only way to do that is to acquire a medallion from one of the would-be Sith hopefuls. Luckily, this being Korriban, there are plenty of nasty punks looking to pick fights, so it doesn't take long, or that much effort, for Revan and co. to find some assholes, do the universe a favor, and kill them before looting their bodies for the medallions. Revan presents the medallion to Yuthura Ban, the number 2 at the Sith Academy, and she decides that he is worthy of entry. His companions are explained away as being his slaves. Thus, Revan enters the Academy, and here we meet my personal favorite non-companion character NPC in the whole game, Head Instructor Uthar Wynn, voiced by Tom Kane, appropriately the man who voiced Vandar Tokar. Firstly, Tom Kane's voice performance is great here. Every line that Uthar delivers is just dripping with evil assurance. But at the same time, he does give off the kind of scholarly air that you might expect of a teacher, because that's exactly what he is. And the setup here is brilliant. A lot of the early part of the Korriban plot is dialogue heavy and exposition. But after all, this is an academy. You're here to be educated, so it actually makes perfect sense that there would be so much exposition. It turns out that the Academy on Korriban has very, very strict standards. Of all the many students and trainees, only one every local year is allowed to take the final test and ascend to full Sithhood. Uthar and Yuthura gather about the 5 most promising-looking hopefuls, including Revan, and lays down the conditions. The hopeful's task is to earn enough prestige before any of the others for Uthar Wynn to decide that they are ready to undergo the final test. Reach the star map hidden deep inside the tomb of the old Sith Lord Nagasado and return alive. Well, how perfectly convenient. Apart from learning and comprehending the code of the Sith, neither Yuthura nor Uthar give any explanation as to how the hopefuls might gain prestige. This actually leads to a pretty clever bit of storytelling through gameplay mechanics. Side quests, so often a diversion from the main story at best, or an annoying grind at worst, are literally mandatory in order to progress the main story. And there are plenty of options to choose from, but we'll come to that in a moment. After Revan has been given his quarters at the Academy, Yuthura Ban approaches him with an offer. In true Sith fashion, she is conspiring to kill her master, Uthar Wynn, and take his place as the head of the Academy, and she thinks that Revan could make a useful ally in this. And really, even without all the exposition on Korriban, this kind of sums up the Sith so succinctly and perfectly. The student learning all that they can from the master, and then seeking to kill them and take their place. It makes you realize that when Darth Bane came along and reformed the Sith under the rule of 2, he was really doing nothing more than just cutting away all of the useless fat. He believed, correctly as it turned out, that the Sith didn't need armies of fallen Jedi to take over the galaxy. All they would need is a brilliant master, an ambitious pupil, patience, and cunning. Too many Sith leads to too much backstabbing, which, despite the Sith's claims that this will actually make them stronger, in reality, as precedent would show time and time again throughout the history of Star Wars, lead to the collapse of every Sith attempt to take over the universe. However, there is more to Yuthura than just treachery. Like a lot of people recruited by Revan and Malak's new Sith Empire, she was originally a disaffected Jedi. Enslaved as a child by the Hutts, always a particularly nasty fate, one night Yuthura found the rage and the strength to kill her Hutt master while he slept and escape. After a few misadventures and nearly being abandoned on a planetoid to die, Euthura was found and rescued by the Jedi Order, who sensed that she was strong in the Force and decided to teach her, despite her being a little old for a Padawan. However, Euthura was never able to let go of her anger towards her enslavers and towards slavery in general. Having suffered the indignities of such servitude, she could very easily empathize with those in similar circumstances. To her mind, the seeming inaction of the Jedi on the matter was too much, and so she defected to the Sith, figuring that at least they would give her the power she felt she would need to fight against such cruel injustice. Of course, as Revan points out, this does beg the question. Ever since she entered the Academy, and especially after she climbed through the ranks to become Uthar Wynn's number 2, has she ever used her newfound power since to free others from the same enslavement that she suffered? It would seem that despite her confidence, Euthura Ban has more than a few doubts about herself and the path she's chosen in life. The other important detail about this encounter is that she is the one who teaches, or I guess in this case reteaches Revan, the Code of the Sith. For all the things that Knights of the Old Republic is remembered for, the great twist, the memorable characters, the exotic locations, its status as one of the greatest Star Wars stories ever written, one of the things that I never heard about with regards to this game and didn't even know until I did some research is that BioWare invented the Code of the Sith. Specifically, BioWare writer and designer David Gator, who, during the development of the game, asked Lucasfilm if the Sith had their own written code as the Jedi did. He was told that no, and that he would have to make up one of his own. And so he did, taking a special inspiration from Hitler's Mein Kampf. The Code of the Sith is a literal slap in the face to the Code of the Jedi and the values that it embodies. The Jedi Code is one that preaches self-abnegation, the seeking of knowledge, and making peace with oneself and one's place in the universe, as well as coming to terms with the inevitability of death. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force. By contrast, the Sith Code reads like a combination of Friedrich Nietzsche and Herbert Spencer. In fact, at one point, Euthura literally says the line, survival of the fittest. It is a code defined by a worship of power, as a tool, as an ideal, as a means of personal liberation, enabling and justifying those who have power to lord it over those who don't, because they are too weak, too fearful, or too restrained by idiotic morals to seize it for themselves. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion I gain strength. Through strength I gain power. Through power I gain victory. Through victory my chains are broken. The Force shall free me. More than anything else, I would argue that this is Knights of the Old Republic's greatest contribution to the Star Wars mythos. The Sith have always been evil. What KOTOR does is that it provides a philosophical lens for exploring that evil. At any rate, as Revan and his slaves begin looking around the Academy for opportunities to gain prestige with Uthar, they run into Karth's estranged son, Dustil. The reunion of father and son is not a happy one. Dustil both resents his father for rarely being there for him and his mother, always being called away to fight either the Mandalorians or the Sith, and he even blames Karth for failing to be there to protect him and his mother when Karath bombarded Telos 4. It does beg the question why he would side with the people responsible for his mother's death and the destruction of his home, but then again, he was very angry and bitter, and children very rarely are the best decision makers. He refuses to accept any of Karth's protestations that the Sith are evil, and even threatens to expose what Revan and the others are really doing at the Academy unless they can provide proof. Luckily, such proof can be found in none other than the office of Uthar Wynn himself. A datapad in Uthar's quarters reveals that when Dustil first came to the Academy, he came with a young woman named Celine, and it soon became clear that he was developing romantic feelings for her. However, Celine lacked Dustil's natural skill and aptitude in the Force. Uthar, seeing Dustil's continued association with Celine as a hindrance to his training, had her quietly eliminated and then lied to Dustil about it, saying that she was killed while exploring the ruins. This proof turns out to be all that is needed to convince Dustil to finally turn away from the dark side. And while he's still not quite prepared to forgive his father, he is at least now open to the chance for reconciliation. Rather than immediately leave Korriban, though, he says that he plans to reveal the true evil of the Sith to some of the other hopefuls so that they can be persuaded to leave with him. Brave kid. With this, plus having killed Karath aboard the Leviathan, Karth is finally able to let go of some of the baggage of his own past, and begin to finally start trusting people again, including Revan. As for gaining prestige with Uthar, there are multiple side quests that you can perform, far too many to enumerate individually, so I'm going to stick with the two that really stood out to me. In the first, you team up with one of the Sith hopefuls to recover a holocron, an ancient artifact from a tomb being guarded by several nasty predators. At the end of the quest, the Sith hopeful claims the holocron for herself and presents it to Uthar in exchange for prestige. The only way for the player to gain any prestige out of it is to kill her and take the holocron for yourself. Otherwise, while Uthar will acknowledge your participation in helping her get the holocron, she was the one who got it and gave it to him. You get no credit whatsoever, because of course the Sith don't reward cooperation. To them, there is only using others to achieve a goal or being used yourself. The idea of a mutually beneficial arrangement is anathema to their philosophy. The other memorable Korriban side quest is going into a tomb to recover a sword belonging to an ancient Sith Lord, and I mean ancient as in a veteran of the Second Great Schism ancient. It turns out, though, that this Sith, Ajunta Paul, lingers in his tomb as a Force ghost, consumed by sorrow and regret, as he realized in his last moments of life, and throughout his death of sorts, the wrongness of his betrayal of the Jedi way. In addition to recovering the 3 swords inside the tomb, only one of which is the genuine sword of Ajunta Paul himself, you also have the chance of trying to redeem the ghost of Paul and get him to embrace the light. After all, in the Star Wars universe, even the dead are not beyond salvation. Afterwards, you are confronted by one of the other hopefuls, and you have the option of either killing him for standing in your way, handing over the real sword and letting him claim the credit and prestige, or give him one of the fake swords, at which point he'll try to hand it over to Uthar. Uthar will immediately see it as a fake and kill him for his stupidity. Because as we've always known ever since Vader first force-choked Mati, the Sith have no tolerance for fools. In the end, Revan gains enough prestige for Uthar Wynn to declare him the next would-be candidate for the final exam. You do have the option of revealing to Uthar Euthura's plan to betray him, only for the Master of the Academy to reveal that he has already been planning to bump off his overambitious subordinate, and makes the counter-offer that you should side with him. It really is a never-ending backstabbing party on Korriban. As per the terms of the final test, Revan is forced to enter the tomb of the ancient Sith Lord Nagasato all on his lonesome, fight his way past the various deadly traps and puzzles, as well as all the nasty creatures that haunt the tomb, including several Terentatecs like the one on Kashyyyk, reach the chamber where lies the final star map, and retrieve a ceremonial lightsaber placed there as proof of his success. Once reunited with Uthar and Euthura, the big choice comes. And this time you have 4 possible outcomes. Side with Euthura against Uthar, kill the Master of the Academy, and then kill Euthura herself when she inevitably decides to betray you as well. Side with Uthar against Euthura, kill her, and then kill Uthar. Side with Uthar against Euthura and then not kill him, at which point he will declare you an official graduate of the Sith Academy. And finally, the canon version, where Revan sides with Euthura against Uthar, but then, when she tries to betray him, overpowers her, but spares her life. Euthura had originally wanted to use her powers for good, to fight against the evil and oppression of slavery. However, after joining the Sith, she's become so locked in the cycle of ambition and treachery that she's lost sight of that goal. But Revan is able to successfully persuade her that there is still a chance for her to reclaim it. The path of the Jedi is still available to her, so long as she is genuinely sincere in the desire to do good once again. After Revan departs the tomb of Nagasato, the rest of the Academy quickly learns of Master Uthar's death and Revan and his friends are forced to fight their way through the Academy, pretty much killing every Sith student in their way before they can reach the Ebon Hawk and escape. Typical Sith, so consumed by ambition and power lust that they inevitably destroy one another. It's no wonder that Darth Bane decided that this was ridiculous and invented the rule of 2. At last, our heroes have all the coordinates needed to find the Star Forge. And so, off goes the Ebon Hawk for the unknown regions, that great swath of unexplored space in the Star Wars galaxy. We have a brief cutscene of Malak trying to torture Bastila into joining the dark side, and at last the Ebon Hawk arrives at its final destination, and we get our first clear look at the Star Forge. A massive space station that literally sucks away the energy of the stars themselves and then uses it to create weapons, vehicles, and any other war material for whoever possesses it. In this case, Darth Malak and his Sith Empire. Now, conceptually, the Starforge isn't unique, even within the canon of Star Wars. It's essentially the same concept as the World Devastators from Dark Empire on a grander scale. Mind you, presentation does make a difference, and it really is a great cutscene as the camera slowly pans up from the surface of the star, watching the energy getting slowly siphoned up into the space station. It makes for a great visual. The object of their long quest finally discovered, Karth has just enough time to send the coordinates of the system to the Republic when a strange disruptor field seizes hold of the Ebon Hawk and pulls it inexorably towards the small planet that the crew will eventually come to know as Rakata Prime. The only good news at this point is that the Ebon Hawk is not the first ship to end up stranded on this world. Countless vessels unlucky enough to wander into the system have been forced to crash land on Rakata Prime by the same mysterious disruptor field, so at least there's plenty of spare parts with which to repair the ship. But inevitably, as our heroes scrounge for parts among the tropical setting, they end up encountering the natives of this world, the long-lost descendants of the ancient builders and the second original alien race created for this game by BioWare after the Cellcath, a race of amphibious, bug-eyed coneheads known as the Rakata, once the rulers of the entire galaxy, now long since fallen into primitive barbarism, divided between two warring factions. The more learned and sagely elders descended from the ancient priests of the Rakata, and the more savage and warlike Black Rakata, led by a warmongering leader who rather pretentiously styles himself simply as the One. From these two factions, Revan is forced to relearn something about his past and also something about the Rakata themselves. There are often individuals among certain species who have a strong connection to the Force, but rare indeed is the example of an entire species with a strong connection to the Force. The Rakata used to be one of these. Over 30,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Rakata established the Infinite Empire, a dominion that stretched across most of the known galaxy. Theirs was not a benevolent rule, for they were a race steeped in the evil of the dark side. So intertwined was the Rakata with the Force that all of their technology was Force-driven. You could only activate it or use it at all by drawing upon the dark side. Among other things, it had the advantage of making sure that the various slave races that they conquered could not use their masters' weapons against them. The Star Forge was, if anything, the crowning achievement of the Infinite Empire. With it, nigh infinite war material lay at the Rakata's disposal. And if the name of their empire wasn't a big giveaway, the Rakata certainly believed that it would be infinite. But then, roughly around the year 25,200 BBY, calamity struck. A mysterious plague that is suggested but never confirmed to have been created by one of the slave races swept through the Infinite Empire, targeting only the Rakata themselves. Over half the population succumbed. The survivors found themselves stripped of their connection to the Force. Suddenly, unable to use their own technology, the Rakata fell prey to mass rebellion by the trillions of beings they had enslaved. The Infinite Empire fell apart, and soon only their homeworld of Rakata Prime remained. Even then, perhaps the Rakata might have rallied and rebuilt at least something of what they'd lost, but the true final nail in their coffin was, ironically, their greatest creation, the Star Forge itself. Like so many things created by the dark side, the Starforge is an artifact steeped in evil, constantly enhancing the negative impulses of others. The remaining Rakata succumbed to their rage and desire for violence and fell into near-endless civil war and barbarism. Weapons of mass destruction were unleashed, and many Rakata only survived by fleeing underground. By the time Revan and Malak had made their first visit to Rakata Prime a few years ago, the Rakata species were little more than savages, having forgotten most if not all of their old technology. However, the two nascent Sith Lords had also discovered that the Rakata were also beginning to reunify. This reunification had begun as a bloody war of conquest, enacted by the so-called Black Rakata and led by their savage and half-cannibalistic leader, the One. Every other tribe had fallen easily before his might, but then the One discovered someone that he could not conquer. A group of Rakata that called themselves the Elders, who lived in close vicinity to a building known only as the Temple of the Ancients. The Elders were descended from the old priestly caste of the Rakata Infinite Empire. The ancestors of the Elders had realized that it was their pride, their arrogance, and their overweening reliance on the dark side that had brought them to this ruin. What few secrets of the ancient Rakata technology that survived the fall of the Empire they had sealed away inside of the temple, including the information needed to access and operate the Starforge. Naturally, the One wished to acquire that knowledge for himself, as his ultimate aspiration was to create a second infinite empire. However, despite being outnumbered, the Elders retained much of the lost technology, and with it have managed to defy the One and his ambitions ever since. This caused many of the recently subjugated tribes to rebel against the One and his Black Rakata once it was clear that they were, in fact, not invincible. As for the Elders themselves, they have continued to guard the Temple of the Ancients and the secrets that lie within. Only they know the means and ways of accessing it. Knowing is not the same as doing, though, as, like all Rakata, the Elders have lost their connection to the Force, and the Force is the only way by which one may enter the temple. When Revan had first come to Rakata Prime in search of the Starforge and already hip deep in the dark side, like a sleazy politician, he made promises to both factions. He promised the One that he would slay the Elders and recover the information that would allow him access to the temple. He then went over to the Elders and promised them that since he could use the Force, he would go into the Temple of the Ancients and destroy the Starforge, which is something the Elders wanted as they believed that by doing so, their race could finally move on from its bloody and vile past. Of course, Darth Revan had broken both of his promises, taking the information and the Starforge for himself. For the redeemed Revan, the initial arrival on Rakata is almost like a bizarre parody of his first coming. The Black Rakata find him first, and he is brought before the One, who demands that he fulfill his original promise to kill the Elders and bring to him the information needed to access the Temple of the Ancients. Then he has to go to the Elders and try his best to convince him that this time he really is sincere about destroying the Starforge, something that the wary Elders are obviously reluctant to believe him on. If Revan were still the Dark Lord he used to be, he would have indeed honored his promise to the One and killed the Elders to retrieve the information. After all, if the Ebon Hawk is to take off again, he needs to get inside the temple and shut off the disruptor field. But Revan is a changed man, and so instead he accepts the Elders' terms. If he really is a good guy this time, he'll go to the Black Rakata's compound and free one of the Elders who was captured by them. And so Revan does just that, slaughtering most of the Black Rakata along the way, as well as their battle rancors and the One himself. At last persuaded of his good intentions, the Elders perform the ritual that grants Revan access to the Temple of the Ancients. After sharing a premonition of danger, Juhani and Jolee insist on accompanying him, while the rest of the Ebon Hawk's crew remain behind to repair the ship. The trio of Jedi fight their way past the various Sith Guardians left behind by Revan and Malak to guard the Temple of the Ancients, and successfully shut off the disruptor field, allowing the Ebon Hawk to leave safely and eliminate a potential threat to the incoming Republic fleet. Shortly afterwards, the trio spy a familiar face. Unfortunately, it is not a happy reunion, as Malak has finally succeeded in breaking Bastila's will and bringing her over to the dark side. This is nothing less than sheer catastrophe. With Bastila's battle meditation on his side, Malak will crush the Republic fleet easily once it arrives in system. Alas, there is no reasoning with Bastila at this stage. Luckily, Malak's new apprentice is no match for 3 Jedi. Forced to recognize Revan's power, she then offers arguably the most momentous choice in the entirety of Knights of the Old Republic. Malak, Revan's former apprentice, betrayed and tried to kill him. Now, Bastila offers to betray her new master and work with Revan to overthrow Malak and help him reclaim his former title as Dark Lord of the Sith. In the end, Revan rejects this offer. Whatever else he was before, that is not who he is now. Bastila curses him for a weak fool and flees back to Malak's side. But if you as the player choose to follow the dark side, well, first you and Bastila kill Juhani and Jolee because they're certainly not going to join you. Then you go back to the crew of the Ebon Hawk and offer them the same choice. Only T3, Canderous, and HK will side with you. Karth ends up fleeing into the jungle and you kill both Mission and Zalbar. In a really dark twist, you can use a combination of Force Persuade and Zalbar's life debt to make him kill Mission with his own hands. Jesus H. Christ, how did BioWare go from this to the 3 color-coded endings of Mass Effect 3? When the mighty fall, my friends, they fall hard. With the disruptor field disabled, the Ebon Hawk is able to safely take off and make for the Starforge just as the Republic fleet arrives. The fleet, led by Admiral Yorn Dodonna, likely a very, very distant ancestor of Jan Dodonna, who commanded the rebels at the Battle of Yavin 4, and Master Vandar Tokar, who managed to escape the attack on Dantooine, are contacted by Karth, who fills them in on the situation. As the rest of the Republic fleet engage the Sith Armada and the Starforge itself, the crew of the Ebon Hawk and a squad of supporting Jedi Knights make for one of the Starforge's landing bays. They must move quickly and fight their way through the station to Bastila and ultimately Darth Malak. So long as Bastila is using her battle meditation in Malak's cause, victory for the Republic is all but impossible. The Starforge certainly doesn't make it easy for our heroes and their Jedi allies. Forged with the power of the dark side eons ago, the Starforge is almost as much a living thing as it is a machine. To it, the intruders are like a virus, and it responds by sending its own version of immunity cells, endless waves of battle droids, supplemented by Darth Malak's Sith acolytes. But even as wave after wave of enemies comes against him, Revan is undeterred. Bastila once helped bring him back from the dark side. Now, he will do the same for her or die trying. Nothing that Malak or the malign Starforge itself can throw against him will stand between him and saving the woman he loves. And so it all comes down to 2 final confrontations. First Bastila, then Malak. The fight with Bastila is pretty straightforward. After Revan is separated from his companions, the former Dark Lord and the former Jedi duke it out. Eventually, Revan overpowers Bastila and is faced with another choice. Execute Bastila, both for her betrayal and to put her out of her misery, as she believes there's no coming back from her own fall to the dark side, or try to persuade her that she can still save herself. This can be done without the romance angle, but requires the player to have put a lot of points into their character's charisma and persuasion skills. In all honesty, the Revan-Bastila romance, which is part of the canon version of the story of KOTOR, isn't the strongest I've ever seen in this franchise. It's reasonably well written, if not exceptional, and the force bond between the two of them does make sense as it allows for a psychic and emotional connection between the two characters. Even without the romance angle, there is an element of obligation here. It is established that, in part, Bastila fell to the dark side because her connection, her force bond to Revan, exposed her to the lingering remnants of the dark side within the former Sith Lord. So there is a slight element of guilt here as well, even though in the end it was Bastila's own choice to give in to Malak's torture and treatment. But of course, the fact that Revan can redeem her is perfectly in keeping with a tradition as old as Star Wars itself. It also works as a bit of symbolism, the closing of the circle, if you will. She helped bring him back to the light, now he will do the same for her. I think the biggest issue may be Jennifer Hale's voice acting. For most of the game, she sounds pretty stoic and aloof, not very emotional apart from the occasional outburst, either at a comment from Revan or one of the companion characters. This makes sense, after all, because the Jedi is all about denying one's emotions. However, after her fall to the dark side, she maintains this tone throughout, even to what is supposed to be the emotional climax of her relationship with Revan. It would make so much more sense for Hale to emote after her fall to the dark side. One, it would make a jarring contrast from when she had been a Jedi. Two, given what the Sith are supposed to be about, it would make sense that she would have unshackled herself from her emotional restraints that were part of her Jedi training. This also applies to her final confrontation with Revan aboard the Starforge. When she begs Revan to kill her as atonement for her betrayal, rather than sound despairing as she should, she sounds tired. And when Revan uses his love for her to pull Bastila back from the abyss, lines that should be delivered with great emotion and pathos instead come off like she's just getting out of bed in the morning. Lines like, "Nothing could make me feel safer than to be loved by you," would have so much more emotional impact if Hale was actually allowed to express emotion in her voice work. And, given her impressive resume, we know that Hale has the talent to do this, otherwise she wouldn't be getting so many voice roles to the point where people complain that she's too omnipresent. So in this instance, I think the fault lies with whoever it was at LucasArts who did the voice direction, because otherwise the scene works really well. It's a logical culmination of the relationship between Bastila and Revan, and it vindicates what Jolee Bindo was saying about love and how the Jedi Council has gotten the matter completely wrong. Having been saved quite literally by the power of true love, Bastila uses her battle meditation to turn the battle against the Sith, while Revan goes off for one final confrontation with his old apprentice. While the epic space battle rages outside, in what is pretty good graphics considering it's 20 years old, we at last come to the final showdown, the final boss.
Foolish words. The darkness and the light wage a constant war within you. The balance is tipped one way now, but it can easily be tipped back. Savior, conqueror, hero, villain. You are all things, Revan, and yet you are nothing. In the end, you belong to neither the light nor the darkness. You will forever stand alone.
As main antagonists go, Malak is decent, but in many ways lacking. He has a great design, and Rafael Ferrer is clearly having a blast yucking it up as the mustache-twirling big bad. His torture of Bastila and literally feeding dying Jedi into the Starforge and then siphoning off their life energy to boost his power certainly reinforces that this is an irredeemable bad guy. But while he's obviously not written to be very complex as a villain, he also seems to lack a lot of the charisma that is necessary to make a really good pure evil villain. The fact that the player has technically beaten this guy once before, as I said earlier, also kind of undermines his intimidation factor. The fact that after Revan finally defeats him, Malak is given a kind of soap opera melancholy speech, almost as if the developers realized at the last minute, hey, we haven't really done much with this guy, let's try and make him sympathetic at the last minute, certainly doesn't help. That said, Malak does have a saving grace, and it's how he functions thematically, particularly as a foil to Revan. In a way, Malak's story is a perfect representation of the Sith ideal. Once he thought himself strong enough, he betrayed his master and attempted to take his place. Now, here he stands, in the same spot where Revan once stood, the master of the dark side, leader of the Sith Empire, steeped in the same evil that once consumed Revan not so long ago. He represents both what Revan used to be and what he could possibly become once again. He is simultaneously Revan's past and possibly his future. In that sense, he works as a foil to Revan even better than Vader worked as a foil to Luke, as Vader really only represented Luke's possible future. This plot point would have worked fine in a TV show or a movie, but it works especially well because KOTOR is a video game, where the player makes the ultimate call on whether or not Revan does indeed re-embrace his battled self or chooses to forge a new path as a servant of the light. The only thing I can say about the final confrontation between Revan and Malak is that it has possibly my favorite theme in the entire game, Darth Malak's theme. mostly because this is where Jeremy Soule, as composer, comes closest to replicating the idea of a full orchestra with all the grandeur that Star Wars calls for. At last, Malak dies. Unlike Bastila, he dies unredeemed. For while redemption is indeed a great theme of Star Wars in general, and of KOTOR in particular, as seen with all the previous examples throughout the main storyline, to say nothing of the side quests, redemption is ultimately only possible for those who are sincerely willing to reach for it. Characters like Bastila and even Yuthura Ban were willing. Malak ultimately doesn't, because he does not see himself as worth saving, even in his final moments. Our heroes make their final escape. The Star Forge is finally damaged enough that it plummets into the sun, with a final explosion worthy of the Death Stars. And, just as the first cutscene mirrored the opening of A New Hope, the last cutscene also mirrors the ending of A New Hope, complete with an awards ceremony and medals. The Sith are defeated and the galaxy is saved, thanks in no small part to Revan, the former Dark Lord of the Sith, now the prodigal Jedi Knight. On reflection, it's easy to see why Knights of the Old Republic has earned its legendary status among fans. Whether or not I've added anything new or interesting to this almost 2 decades old conversation is up to you to decide. Most of the characters are at least memorable, with a few true standouts. The only one that obviously I didn't go into any great detail on was Revan himself. Even within the canon storyline, where he chooses the light side and romances Bastila, there is far too many possible variations based on player choice to really assess him as a character. He is, after all, meant to be a blank slate upon which the player can create his own hero of the Star Wars galaxy. The story is well written, taking full advantage of it being a video game RPG. While the twist reveal of Revan's identity is still the standout, KOTOR should also be praised for expanding upon and even critiquing somewhat the philosophy of the Jedi, while for the first time providing the Sith with a philosophy of their very own. The game takes the player to many varied and exotic locales, some familiar, some brand new. And in a way, Knights of the Old Republic better represents the Star Wars universe than any film or book precisely because it's a video game. Star Wars is often incorrectly characterized as a universe of good guys and bad guys. The reality is a bit more subtle. It is a universe where people can choose good or evil. And KOTOR represents this in a way that no film or book can do, regardless of how good it is, because the other forms require a passive audience, whereas a game requires active participation. In the hands of the player lie the decision to choose the light side or the dark side. And unlike the admittedly few Star Wars games I've looked at thus far, where the dark side storyline really doesn't make any sense and feels like it's just there because it's a Star Wars game, because of the nature of Revan as a character within the universe and how the story works around him, I could easily see the dark side storyline being a valid canon storyline. It's just as well set up as the light side storyline, and the payoff makes narrative sense. Above all else, what makes Knights of the Old Republic so beloved and so good as a Star Wars story is that narratively and thematically, it understands, embraces, and fully represents everything that makes Star Wars special. Its sequel would gain fame and indeed notoriety for doing the exact opposite, by picking apart those tropes and themes and narrative devices that we generally take for granted and applying a healthy dose of skepticism. Thank you all again for your patience, and look forward to the conclusion of the KOTOR special with Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords. Until then.